Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The loft smelled like lavender and something metallic I couldn't quite place. I stood in the doorway that first evening, keys cold in my palm, scanning the open concept space that stretched before me. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city's twilight glow, casting long shadows across blonde hardwood floors. Everything was pristine, almost aggressively so. White walls, minimalist furniture, strategically placed succulents that probably cost more than my monthly rent. The kind of place that made you afraid to touch anything. The cat, a sleek gray thing with yellow eyes, watched me from atop a leather sofa. It didn't meow, didn't move, just stared with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The owners, I'll call them the Reeds, though that wasn't their real name, had been overly specific in their instructions. Water the plants every other day, feed the cat precisely 1 can of food each evening. No more, no less. Don't touch anything in the office. Don't open the bedroom closet. The list went on, typed in a neat document they'd left on the kitchen counter, weighted down by a smooth river stone. Simple enough. I needed the money, and 3 nights of cat sitting in a luxury loft beat my usual gig economy scramble. I'd agreed without asking too many questions. That was my first mistake. The second came 2 hours later when I went looking for scissors. I'd fed the cat, poured the gelatinous mass from the can into its ceramic bowl, but the packaging for the dry food was sealed with that impossible plastic that requires either scissors or teeth, and I wasn't desperate enough to use my mouth. The kitchen drawers were organized with the same meticulous precision as the rest of the apartment. Utensils in perfect rows. Dish towels folded into identical rectangles. Everything in its place, except in the 3rd drawer. The scissors were there, silver and sharp, resting on top of other things. Things that didn't belong in a silverware drawer. Things that made my hand freeze halfway to the handle. A leather belt, folded twice, the buckle facing inward. The leather was worn smooth in places, darker in others, as if from repeated handling. Next to it, a pair of surgical gloves, still in their paper wrapper but opened. And beneath that, a cloth. It might have been a dish towel once, with brown stains dried into the fibers in patterns that looked disturbingly deliberate. I pulled my hand back. The cat appeared beside me, silent as smoke, and I flinched. It looked up at me, then at the drawer, then back at me. Its pupils were fully dilated despite the bright kitchen light. I closed the drawer carefully, the slide of wood against wood too loud in the sudden silence. The apartment felt different then. The lavender smell seemed cloying, artificial, like it was hiding something underneath. I became aware of every sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant rumble of traffic far below, the almost imperceptible creak of the building settling. Or was it settling? Old buildings made noises, I told myself. That's all this was. I fed the cat the dry food by tearing the bag open with my hands. That night I tried to sleep on the sofa they'd designated for me, but the city lights through those massive windows made the loft feel like a fishbowl. I kept thinking about the drawer, tried to invent innocent explanations. Maybe they were into theater and those were props. Maybe they did medical work from home. Maybe the cloth was stained with wine or paint or any of a dozen harmless substances that dried brown. But surgical gloves and a belt? I must have drifted off eventually because I woke to a sound, a sharp rap on the door that had my heart hammering before I was fully conscious. The mantel clock read 2:47 a.m. The cat was nowhere to be seen. I approached the door on unsteady legs, peered through the peephole. A man stood in the hallway, 60s maybe, wearing a bathrobe and an expression of agitation. The building's harsh fluorescent lighting made his face look waxy and strange. He knocked again, and I opened the door a crack, keeping the chain on. He lived directly below, he explained without preamble. Apartment 4B. He wanted to know if everything was all right up here. His voice had a quaver to it, like he wasn't sure he should be asking. I told him everything was fine, that I was just watching the place while the owners traveled. He nodded slowly, his eyes searching past me into the loft, and then he said something that made my mouth go dry. Last weekend he'd heard noises, late Saturday night. He described them as muffled screaming, the kind that came through walls distorted but unmistakable. He'd almost called the police, he said, but then the sounds stopped. It had been bothering him all week. He just wanted to make sure everything was okay. I assured him it was, my voice sounding hollow even to my own ears. He lingered a moment longer, as if waiting for me to say something else, then shuffled back toward the elevator. I locked the door and stood there, breathing too fast. The bathroom was down a short hallway, all white tile and chrome fixtures. I splashed water on my face, trying to rationalize. The neighbor was old. Maybe he'd dreamed it or imagined it or heard something from a different apartment. Old buildings carried sound in strange ways. But as I dried my hands, I noticed something I hadn't seen earlier. The shower stall had a glass door that gleamed spotless, but along the tile walls inside there were marks. Fresh ones. Thin scratches in the grout, at about shoulder height, running horizontally. And indentations. Small, round depressions in the wall itself, as if something metal had been pressed there with considerable force. The marks formed a pattern, evenly spaced, like anchor points. My hands started shaking. I backed out of the bathroom and retrieved my phone from the living room. The screen's glow felt obscene in the dark loft. I typed out a message to the number they'd given me for emergencies, my thumbs clumsy with adrenaline. Just wanted to check in. Found some things in the kitchen drawer that seemed odd. Is everything okay? The response came within minutes. Too quickly for someone who was supposed to be traveling abroad in a different time zone. The message was from him, the male half of the couple. His texts were effusive, almost aggressively friendly. Everything's fine. So sorry about that drawer, meant to clean it out before we left. Please just close it and don't worry about it. How's our baby? He meant the cat. Hope you're comfortable. The exclamation points felt wrong, like someone trying too hard to sound casual. I replied that I'd noticed some marks in the bathroom. Was there recent construction? This time the response took longer. 5 minutes. 10. When it came, the tone had shifted slightly. Those are old. Been meaning to fix them. Nothing to worry about. Thanks for being so thorough. Get some rest. I didn't rest. Instead, I moved through the loft with my phone's flashlight, photographing everything. The drawer's contents, laid out precisely as I'd found them. The marks in the shower, the view from every window. The office they'd told me not to enter. I opened that door too, found it disappointingly normal. Desk, computer, filing cabinets, all locked. I sent the photos to my personal email, then to 2 friends with a message saying if anything happened to me, here's where I was. It felt melodramatic, even as I did it. But the alternative, ignoring what I'd found, felt worse. The building's super wasn't available until morning, but I left a voicemail explaining my concerns in the calmest voice I could manage. Then I called the non-emergency police line. The dispatcher sounded bored as I described what I'd found. They said they'd send someone to take a report, but made it clear this wasn't a priority. Odd items in a drawer didn't constitute evidence of a crime, she explained patiently. The marks in the bathroom could be anything. Had I witnessed any actual criminal activity? No. Then all they could do was document my concerns. I hung up feeling foolish and terrified in equal measure. The cat reappeared as dawn began to break. It jumped onto the sofa beside me and began grooming itself with methodical precision, occasionally pausing to look at me with those unsettling yellow eyes. I wondered what it had seen in this apartment, what it knew that I didn't. The police came that afternoon, 2 officers who looked young enough to be in college. They were polite but skeptical, their body language screaming that they considered this a waste of time. They examined the drawer, the bathroom, took notes. One of them asked if I'd been drinking. I said no. They took down the owner's contact information and left, telling me to call if anything else happened. Their emphasis on the word happened made it clear they didn't expect anything would. I should have left then, should have packed my bag, left a note, and gone back to my cramped studio apartment across town. But something stubborn in me refused. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the memory of the neighbor's frightened face. Maybe I just needed to know. The second night was worse. I made myself dinner from food in the refrigerator, though I could barely eat. The loft felt different after dark, the shadows deeper, the silence more absolute. The cat followed me everywhere, staying just at the edge of my peripheral vision. Every time I turned to look at it directly, it would be staring at something else, its head tilted as if listening. Around midnight, my phone buzzed. Another message from him. Just wanted to apologize for any confusion. We've had a stressful time lately. Hope everything's going smoothly. You're doing great. I typed back asking when they'd be returning. The reply came instantly. Change of plans. We'll be back a day early. See you tomorrow evening. Tomorrow. That meant one more night. I couldn't sleep. Every sound became magnified. The cat's paws on hardwood, the building's endless settling, the wind against the windows. At some point, I got up and went back to the bathroom. The marks in the shower seemed more pronounced in the darkness, shadows pooling in the indentations. I ran my fingers over them, felt how deep they went. Something had been attached here. Recently, I checked the drawer again. The items had been rearranged, subtly, but definitely moved. The belt was folded differently. The gloves were gone entirely. Had they been there before? I tried to remember, realized with creeping dread that I couldn't be certain. My photographs would show it, but I couldn't bring myself to look at them. Didn't want to see proof that things were changing. The cat sat in the kitchen doorway, watching me with an expression I could only describe as knowing. I spent the rest of the night in the living room, lights on, waiting for morning. They arrived at 8 p.m., exactly as promised. Except only one of them came through the door. He looked tired, dark circles under his eyes, his smile too tight. He thanked me profusely, handed me cash in a white envelope, asked how everything went. His words came too fast, tumbling over each other. Behind him, the hallway was empty. I asked about his partner, trying to sound casual, and his face did something strange. A flicker of something I couldn't name before the smile snapped back into place. She decided to move out, he explained. Sudden thing. Just needed space. Things had been difficult between them. She'd already collected her belongings. He delivered this information in a monotone, as if reading from a script he'd memorized. I wanted to ask more, but the way he stood in the doorway, not quite blocking it but not quite inviting further conversation, made it clear the discussion was over. I grabbed my bag, mumbled something about hoping everything worked out, and left. In the elevator descending, I pulled out my phone and looked at the photos I'd taken. The drawer contents, sharp and clear. The bathroom marks, undeniable. But when I swiped to the last photo, one I didn't remember taking, my hands went cold. It was a picture of the bedroom door, the one I hadn't opened. But in the photo, it was ajar, and in the gap, barely visible in the darkness beyond, was the pale oval of a face. The elevator reached the ground floor with a gentle chime. I never went back to that building, never called to follow up, never responded when he texted a few days later, cheerfully asking if I'd be available for future jobs. The police said they'd done a wellness check and everything was fine, both residents accounted for, no signs of distress. When I mentioned the neighbors' concerns, they said he'd been checked on too, and was satisfied with their investigation. A month later, I saw a moving truck outside the building. I watched from across the street as movers carried furniture out. He was there, directing them, looking healthier than before, almost relaxed. He saw me, I think, raised a hand in greeting or maybe warning. I didn't wave back. The thing is, I've started seeing that cat around my neighborhood. Not the same one, obviously. Couldn't be. But a gray cat with yellow eyes that sits outside my building sometimes, watching the entrance. It's probably just a stray, a coincidence, nothing more. But last night I found something in my jacket pocket. The jacket I wore to the loft. A surgical glove still in its wrapper. I know I didn't put it there, and I know I checked those pockets a dozen times since that night. The glove sits on my kitchen counter now, I can't bring myself to throw it away. Can't bring myself to touch it either. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the drawer, about how things had been rearranged, about the face in the photograph I don't remember taking, about the way he smiled when he said she'd moved out, that tight smile that never reached his eyes. And I wonder if I should have looked in the bedroom closet after all. I wonder if I should have stayed. I wonder if she's still wondering the same thing. Story 2. The fluorescent lights of the mall flickered as I pushed through the glass doors, gym bag slung over my shoulder. My muscles ached in that satisfying way they do after a good workout, but the endorphins were already fading, replaced by the hollow exhaustion of a Wednesday night. The mall was a skeleton of itself at this hour. Most stores shuttered behind metal grates, the food court chairs stacked on tables like a graveyard of plastic furniture. My footsteps echoed too loudly against the polished floors, each step a small announcement of my presence in the empty space. That's when I first noticed it. A white SUV, sleek and expensive looking, rolled past the main entrance just as I approached the doors leading to the parking lot. The windows were tinted so dark they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I wouldn't have thought anything of it. People drove white SUVs all the time, except that it moved with a deliberate slowness, the kind of crawl that suggested the driver was looking for something. Or someone. I stepped outside into the cooling night air, the humidity still clinging to everything despite the hour. The parking lot sprawled before me, mostly empty except for a few scattered vehicles near the mall's anchor stores. My car sat in the far section, where I always parked to get those extra steps in. The fitness tracker on my wrist had become a tyrant I couldn't quite escape. The SUV appeared again, this time cruising down the lane parallel to my walking path. It maintained the same glacial pace, and something primal in my chest tightened. I told myself I was being paranoid, probably someone looking for a parking spot, though that made little sense given how empty everything was. I adjusted my bag on my shoulder and kept walking, trying to project an air of casual confidence I didn't quite feel. By the third pass, confidence had evaporated entirely. The vehicle emerged from behind a service entrance, its headlights cutting through the gathering darkness. And this time there was no denying it. The SUV was pacing me. It stayed exactly far enough away to seem coincidental, yet close enough that I could feel its presence like a cold hand on the back of my neck. The engine purred with a quality that suggested money, real money, the kind that didn't worry about gas prices or monthly payments. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, each beat a little timpani of fear. I'd read the articles, seen the news segments about carjackings and abductions in parking lots. But this felt different, more deliberate, more personal. Instead of continuing toward my car, I veered left, cutting through a brightly lit section of the lot near a still-open grocery store. The lights were harsh and clinical, the kind that made everyone look slightly unwell, but right now they felt like sanctuary. I glanced back. The SUV had slowed to a stop, idling near a lamppost. I couldn't see through those black windows, but I could feel eyes on me, studying, calculating. The 24-hour pharmacy sat at the corner of the strip mall, its neon cross glowing like a beacon. I'd never been so grateful for corporate America's commitment to round-the-clock consumer access. I pushed through the doors, and the artificial chill of the air conditioning hit me like a slap. The fluorescent lights were even more unforgiving than the parking lots, casting everything in a sickly blue-white glow. A young attendant stood behind the counter, scrolling through his phone with the vacant expression of someone enduring the graveyard shift. He barely looked up as I entered, just gave a slight nod that might have been acknowledgement or might have been a tick. I grabbed a basket and started moving through the aisles, pretending to shop while my mind raced. Through the large windows at the front of the store, I could see it. The white SUV, parked directly across from the entrance. The engine was still running. I could see the slight shimmer of exhaust in the cool night air. Whoever was inside wasn't even pretending anymore. They were waiting. My hands trembled as I picked up items at random. A bottle of vitamins I didn't need, toothpaste in a flavor I'd never use, a magazine I'd never read. The normalcy of these objects felt absurd against the rising tide of panic in my chest. I circled back to the counter, where the attendant had finally looked up, perhaps noticing my agitation. The words came out before I'd fully formed the plan. I told him there was someone following me, asked if he could call mall security, make it seem official. To his credit, he didn't question it. Maybe he'd been trained for situations like this, or maybe he'd seen enough strange things during night shifts that nothing surprised him anymore. He picked up the phone, spoke in low tones to someone, or perhaps to no one, while I stood there trying to control my breathing. Within minutes, he offered to walk me out through the service exit, a route that led to a different section of the complex entirely. As we moved through the narrow hallways behind the pharmacy, past towers of inventory and handwritten schedules pinned to bulletin boards, I felt a mixture of relief and embarrassment. What if I was overreacting? What if it was just coincidence, and I'd look back on this night as the moment my anxiety finally tipped into something clinical? But when we emerged into the night air, circling around to where I'd parked, the SUV was gone. The absence should have comforted me. Instead, it felt ominous, like the space where a tooth had been knocked out, wrong and conspicuous in its emptiness. I thanked the attendant, got in my car, and drove home through the sleeping city streets, checking my rearview mirror every few seconds until the repetitive motion became almost meditative. Nothing followed me. Nothing appeared. By the time I pulled into my building's underground garage, I'd almost convinced myself it had been nothing. Almost. The next evening, I saw it again. I'd come home from work via a different route, a conscious decision that I'd told myself was about avoiding traffic, rather than avoiding white SUVs. My building sat on a quiet street in a neighborhood that straddled the line between up-and-coming and gentrified, where old houses with peeling paint stood next to renovated townhomes, with security systems and Ring doorbells. I pulled up to the gate, waiting for the automatic sensor to register my car. That's when I spotted it. The white SUV, parked about half a block down the street, tucked against the curb between a minivan and a sedan, far enough away that it didn't seem obvious, close enough that I couldn't miss it once I was looking, and crucially positioned just outside the range of the security cameras I knew dotted our building's perimeter. My hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. This couldn't be coincidence. The city had thousands of white SUVs, but the same one, following me from the mall to my home? The probability approached zero, and yet here it was, undeniable as a bruise. I sat there for a long moment after the gate closed behind me, watching the vehicle in my side mirror. It didn't move. The windows remained impenetrably dark. I couldn't even tell if anyone was inside, though the logical part of my brain insisted someone must be. Cars didn't drive themselves, not yet anyway. Over the next 3 days, the SUV became a fixture of my landscape. It appeared at different times, always in slightly different positions, but always within view of my building and always just beyond camera range. I began to notice things. It never parked in the same spot twice. It never stayed for more than an hour at a time, and it never, ever revealed its occupant. I changed my routine with the fervor of someone performing a ritual to ward off evil spirits. I left at different times each morning, took alternate routes to work, came home via circuitous paths that added 20 minutes to my commute. Nothing worked. The SUV found me, or was already there, waiting with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. Sleep became difficult. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the building's nighttime sounds, the hum of air conditioning, the distant bark of dogs, the occasional car passing on the street below. Every engine sound made me tense, wondering if it was the SUV, circling like a shark. I'd get up, peer through my blinds down at the street, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes, I'd see it there, silent, watching. The paranoia metastasized. At the grocery store, I found myself scanning the parking lot for white SUVs. There were dozens, of course, but none with that particular configuration of tinted windows and chrome accents. At work, I'd look out my office window and imagine I saw it parked across the street, though the distance and traffic made it impossible to be certain. My colleagues began to notice my distraction, my constant glances toward windows and doorways, but I couldn't tell them. How do you explain that you're being followed by a vehicle that never does anything but exist in your peripheral vision? Then came the incident with the gate control. My building used electronic fobs to open the parking garage gate. Simple devices the size of a matchbox that clipped to your sun visor. I'd had mine for 3 years without incident, but one morning I reached up to click it as I approached the gate, and it was gone. Not fallen to the floor, not slipped between the seats. Gone, as if it had never existed. I'd had to explain to the building manager, a perpetually harried woman who always seemed one complaint away from quitting, that I'd lost my fob and needed a replacement. She'd given me that look, the one that said I was now filed under problem tenant, and processed the request with bureaucratic efficiency. The replacement would take a week. During that week, I had to use the visitor entrance, pressing a button and explaining to whoever was on the other end of the intercom that I lived there, but had temporarily lost my access. It was humiliating, but more than that, it was unsettling. I couldn't shake the feeling that the fob hadn't been lost, that it had been taken. Then, exactly 7 days later, I found it. Right there on my sun visor, clipped in place as if it had never left. I sat in my car in the building's parking garage, staring at the small black device, feeling my sense of reality begin to blur at the edges. Had I somehow missed it every single day? Had I been so stressed that I'd overlooked something so obvious? Or had someone, somehow, taken it and then returned it? I went to the doorman that evening, a stoic older man who worked the evening shift and had seen enough in his years to approach everything with philosophical detachment. I asked him, trying to keep my voice casual, whether anyone had inquired about me recently, whether any visitors had asked which unit I lived in, whether he'd noticed anyone unusual hanging around. He regarded me with those steady, worldly eyes, and said that no one had asked about me specifically, but admitted that the building had recently discovered something troubling. One of the spare gate fobs from the office had gone missing about 2 weeks ago. It had just turned up again, back in the drawer where they kept the spares, though no one could explain where it had been. The timeline aligned perfectly. My missing week, the spare's missing week, and during that period, the white SUV's appearances had increased in frequency and boldness. That night, I stood at my window for hours, watching the street below. The SUV wasn't there, at least not where I could see it, but that somehow made things worse. I'd almost prefer its presence to its absence, because at least then I'd know where it was. The not knowing had become its own form of torture. I started researching. Late-night internet rabbit holes led me to forums about stalking, surveillance, private investigators. I learned about GPS trackers small enough to hide in wheel wells, about how easy it was to clone electronic fobs, about the terrifying efficiency of modern surveillance technology. I checked my car obsessively, running my hands along every surface, looking for anything out of place. I found nothing, but the not finding proved nothing. Absence of evidence wasn't evidence of absence. My phone became both lifeline and liability. I documented every sighting of the SUV with photos and timestamps, building a case file for a crime that hadn't technically occurred. But when I looked at the photos later, they seemed to prove nothing. Just images of a white SUV parked on a public street. No law was being broken, no explicit threat was being made. Just presence. Just watching. I considered going to the police, but what would I say? A car keeps parking near my building. Someone borrowed a gate fob without permission and then returned it. I could already imagine the look on the officer's face, the unspoken assessment that I was either paranoid or attention-seeking. Without a direct threat, without evidence of actual crime, there was nothing they could do. The psychological toll began to manifest physically. I lost weight because eating required a level of presence I couldn't muster. Dark circles appeared under my eyes, deep enough that coworkers asked if I was feeling all right. I snapped at people for minor infractions, my patience eroded by sleeplessness and constant vigilance. My performance at work suffered. Everything suffered, but I couldn't stop looking, couldn't stop checking. Because the alternative, pretending it wasn't happening, going back to normal, felt like surrendering to something I didn't understand and couldn't fight. 3 weeks after the first sighting, something changed. I came home late from a failed attempt to work through my backlog of tasks. The clock pushing past midnight. The street was dead. That particular quality of silence that cities achieve only in the deepest hours of night. My building's facade was mostly dark, just a few windows glowing with the blue light of late-night television or insomnia. And there, in a spot it had never used before, directly across from my building's main entrance, brazenly positioned within full view of the security cameras, sat the white SUV. My breath caught. This was different. This was a deviation from the pattern, and pattern deviations meant something. I sat in my car in the garage, heart hammering, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to march up to the vehicle, confront whoever was inside, demand answers. But a deeper, more primitive part whispered warnings I couldn't ignore. Instead, I went up to my apartment and called the doorman. I told him about the SUV, asked him to note it in the incident log. He said he would, assured me in that steady voice that he'd keep an eye on it. I thanked him and hung up, but the reassurance felt hollow. I positioned myself at my window, lights off, watching the vehicle below. Minutes passed, then an hour. The SUV remained perfectly still, a monument to menace or perhaps just an expensive piece of metal that my fractured psyche had imbued with malevolent significance. At 2:47 a.m., the driver's door opened. My pulse spiked so violently I thought I might pass out. This was it. I was finally going to see who had been following me, who had been turning my life into a waking nightmare of paranoia and fear. A figure emerged. Tall, wearing dark clothing, face obscured by the angle and distance. They stood beside the SUV for a long moment, and even though I couldn't see their face, I knew, felt with absolute certainty, that they were looking up at my window, looking at me. Then they did something that made my blood freeze. They raised one hand in a slow, deliberate wave. They knew I was watching, had probably always known. This whole time, the surveillance had been mutual, except I'd been operating under the illusion that I was the observer documenting the threat, when really I was the one being studied, cataloged, known. The figure got back in the SUV, and the vehicle pulled away, turning the corner with that same unhurried grace it always displayed. I stood at my window, trembling, my mind fracturing into 1,000 possible explanations, none of them complete, all of them terrifying. The next morning, I went to check the building's security footage, desperate for confirmation of what I'd seen. The doorman pulled up the relevant timestamp, and we watched together as the cameras showed my building's entrance, the empty street beyond. There was no white SUV in the frame, no figure emerging, no wave. The doorman gave me a concerned look, the kind medical professionals probably practice in mirrors. He suggested gently that perhaps the stress was getting to me, that maybe I should consider taking some time off, seeing someone to talk about the pressure I was under. I nodded mutely, thanked him, and went back to my apartment. I sat on my couch, staring at my hands, trying to reconcile what I'd seen with what the cameras hadn't recorded. Two possibilities presented themselves, neither comforting. Either I was losing my mind, experiencing some kind of stress-induced psychotic break, or whatever was following me existed in the spaces between what cameras could capture and what reality permitted. That afternoon, I found something that made me question everything even further. While moving some boxes in my storage unit in the building's basement, I discovered an old journal from college tucked into a box of books I hadn't opened in years. I didn't remember putting it there. The handwriting was mine, unmistakably mine, but the entries described events I had no memory of experiencing. One entry, dated almost 10 years ago, described seeing a white SUV following me from campus to my apartment. Another, from a few months later, detailed paranoid thoughts about being watched, about gate codes being compromised, about reality itself becoming unreliable. The entries ended abruptly mid-sentence, as if the writer had simply stopped existing in the middle of a word. I don't remember writing any of it, not a single word. But the handwriting is mine. The paper has aged appropriately. The details are too specific to be coincidence. Now, as I sit here writing this, I hear the familiar sound of an engine idling outside. I don't need to look to know what I'll see. The white SUV is back, or perhaps it never left. Perhaps it's been there all along, in the gaps between my awareness, waiting for me to finally understand what I still can't quite grasp. The question that haunts me isn't whether the SUV is real, it's whether I am. Whether this moment is the first time I've lived it, or if I'm caught in some terrible loop, discovering the same journal, making the same realizations, experiencing the same fear over and over, each iteration convinced it's the first. The sun is setting outside my window, the shadows are growing longer, and I can feel it again. That sensation of being watched, of being known, of being something's patient subject in an experiment I don't understand and never agreed to participate in. Tomorrow, I tell myself, I'll do something different. I'll break the pattern. I'll confront this directly, whatever this is. But I've found myself thinking that before, haven't I? Written it in journals I'll later discover and not remember writing. The thought is there, hovering at the edge of my consciousness like a word I can't quite recall. The engine outside revs slightly, a mechanical throat clearing. An invitation or a warning, I can't tell which. I stand up and walk to the window. The white SUV sits below, exactly where I knew it would be. The window rolls down, just a crack, just enough to suggest there's someone inside, though I still can't see a face. And in that narrow opening, in the gathering darkness, something that might be a hand raises in that same slow, deliberate wave. I wave back this time. I don't know why. The gesture feels both like surrender and acknowledgement, as if we've both finally dropped the pretense that this was ever anything but inevitable. The window rolls up. The SUV doesn't leave. And I turn away from the window, walking back to my couch, to this account I'm writing that I may or may not remember creating. Tomorrow I'll wake up, go to work, come home. The SUV might be there, it might not. But the fear will remain, constant as breath, certain as the journal I'll find again someday, wondering who wrote these words and why they feel so familiar. The only thing I know for sure is this: I'm being watched. Whether by something outside my window or something inside my mind hardly matters anymore. The distinction has collapsed, leaving only the watching itself, endless, patient, and utterly inescapable. The engine outside cuts off. In the sudden silence, I can hear my own heartbeat, counting down to a moment I've already lived, will live again, am living now. And somewhere in the darkness, I know it's counting too. Story 3. The building manager said the locks were fine, said they'd been replaced 2 years ago after the last incident, though he never specified what that incident was. My roommate and I ordered the smart lock anyway, along with a doorbell camera that promised real-time alerts and cloud storage. We installed them on a Sunday afternoon while rain hammered the cracked windows of our 6th-floor apartment, water pooling in the corner where the ceiling tiles sagged like rotted flesh. The neighborhood had changed. Or maybe it had always been this way, and I'd simply stopped noticing. The convenience store on the corner now kept its cashier behind bulletproof glass. The elevator in our building worked 3 days out of 7. At night, footsteps echoed through the concrete stairwell at odd hours. Too heavy to be residents, too purposeful to be random. My roommate finished tightening the last screw on the camera mount and stepped back, admiring our work. The device gleamed against the chipped paint of our door frame, its lens like a black eye surveying the dim hallway. We tested it from inside, watching on our phones as the feed showed the corridor stretching away toward the stairwell, lit by a single fluorescent tube that flickered in irregular intervals. For 3 weeks, nothing happened. The camera recorded the occasional neighbor shuffling past, the building manager's monthly inspection rounds, a stray cat that had somehow found its way to our floor. The smart lock chirped each time we unlocked it with our phones, a cheerful sound that seemed absurdly out of place in the decaying building. We felt safer. That was our first mistake. The night it happened, I woke to silence. Not the ordinary silence of 3 a.m., but something deeper, an absence of sound so complete it felt like pressure against my eardrums. No traffic noise filtered up from the street. No pipes clanged in the walls. Even the perpetual hum of the building's ancient electrical system had ceased, leaving only the sound of my own breathing and the thud of blood in my temples. Then came the scraping. Metal on metal, sharp and deliberate. It lasted 3 seconds, then stopped. I lay rigid in bed, staring at the darkness of my ceiling, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. My phone sat on the nightstand, screen dark. I reached for it, thumb finding the home button. Nothing happened. The screen stayed black. I pressed harder, holding the button down. Dead. It had been at 70% when I'd gone to sleep. I sat up, now fully awake, and that's when I noticed the quality of the darkness. Not just the absence of light from my phone, but total darkness. The LED strip we'd installed under the kitchen counter, off. The glow of the router by the TV, gone. The small indicator light on the smoke detector, extinguished. Everything electronic in the apartment had died simultaneously. My roommate's door creaked open. I heard him stumble into the hallway, his voice rough with sleep, asking if the power had gone out. Before I could answer, the sound came again. Scraping metal, louder now, definitely from our front door, and beneath it, another sound. Soft, mechanical clicking, like someone working a lockpick. I moved to the door, bare feet silent on the cold floor. The peephole was a circle of slightly lighter darkness. I pressed my eye against it and my stomach dropped. A figure stood in the hallway, visible only in silhouette against the emergency exit sign at the far end. But that sign was supposed to be broken, had been broken for months. Now it cast a sickly green glow that seemed to writhe rather than shine steadily. The figure wasn't moving, just standing there facing our door. Tall, wearing what looked like ordinary clothes, no mask or hood, just standing, watching. Behind me, my roommate whispered something about the camera, about checking the feed. I turned to tell him the phones were dead, and that's when we heard it. Rapid footsteps hammering down the stairwell, purposefully loud, echoing through the concrete shaft. A distraction. Someone wanted us listening to the stairs while something else happened at our door. When I looked through the peephole again, the figure hadn't moved, but now I could see its eyes catching that diseased green light, reflecting it back like an animal's. Human eyes shouldn't reflect light that way. My roommate was at the door now, reaching for the smart lock's manual override. His fingers found the keypad, pressed the emergency unlock code we'd programmed. Nothing. The lock stayed engaged, but when he tried the code again, the device didn't even beep. Dead. Like everything else electronic in the apartment. The scratching at the door intensified, no longer trying to be subtle. I could hear metal teeth biting into metal, the cylinder of the lock being manipulated by something more sophisticated than a simple pick. My roommate grabbed the security chain, we'd kept it installed despite the smart lock, and slid it into place. The thin brass links looked pathetically inadequate. I ran to the kitchen, fumbling through the junk drawer until my fingers closed around the doorstop wedge we'd bought but never used. Back at the entrance, I jammed it under the door, stomping it tight. My roommate had found his phone, was jabbing at the screen uselessly, his face pale in the ambient glow of streetlights filtering through our windows. The building manager's number, the neighborhood security patrol. We needed to call someone, but our phones were just expensive paperweights now. The scratching stopped. I pressed my eye to the peephole again. The figure was gone. The hallway stood empty, that impossible emergency light still casting its wrong-colored illumination. For 30 seconds, nothing moved. Then I saw it. Another figure, this one at the far end of the corridor near the stairwell, back turned to us. This one was crouched down, doing something with what looked like a long, thin object. When it stood and moved away, the object remained. A wire or cable, barely visible, running along the baseboard. My roommate managed to get his old laptop running on battery power, tried connecting to Wi-Fi. No networks appeared. Not ours, not our neighbors, not even the coffee shop signal that usually bled through from downstairs. It was as if every wireless signal in the building had been snuffed out like a candle. We spent the rest of the night taking turns at the peephole, watching the empty hallway. The strange light from the exit sign never stabilized, never stopped its nauseating pulse. Twice, I thought I saw shadows moving at the periphery of my vision, shapes that didn't correlate with any physical presence. Once, my roommate grabbed my shoulder and pointed at the gap beneath our door, where he swore he'd seen something sliding, thin, dark, like a wire being fed through. But when I looked, there was nothing. Dawn came slowly, reality reasserting itself in grudging increments. The power flickered back on at 6:47 a.m. according to the microwave clock. Our phones buzzed simultaneously, flooded with disconnection notifications from our smart home apps. The camera's feed showed nothing, just static from 2:58 a.m. until the power returned, 4 hours of dead air. We opened the door carefully, chain still attached, peering through the gap. The hallway looked ordinary in the weak morning light. Scuffed walls, stained carpet, the elevator doors scratched and dented. The emergency exit sign was dark again, its plastic cover cracked and hanging loose like always. But the lock told a different story. Under the mounting plate, fresh scratches glinted in the metal, the unmistakable marks of a bypass tool, the kind professional locksmiths use, or someone trained to defeat security systems. When we checked behind the fire extinguisher mounted on the wall, we found it. A thin whip antenna, coiled and tucked into the gap between the extinguisher and its bracket, still warm to the touch. The building manager said we must have been mistaken. Said no one could have gotten past building security. Said the power outage had been reported by several tenants, probably just a transformer issue. He didn't explain the marks on our lock. Didn't explain the antenna. Didn't explain why our camera had recorded nothing during the exact window when it should have captured whoever attacked our door. We upgraded everything. Got a router with 4G failover. Couldn't jam that without serious equipment. Mounted an interior camera aimed at the door, with its own battery backup and local storage. Bought a security bar that wedged between the door and the floor. Solid steel. Couldn't be defeated by any lockpick or bypass tool. My roommate even got a baseball bat, kept it propped beside his bed. 2 weeks passed. I started sleeping better, convinced we'd scared them off, whoever they were. Started to believe the building manager's explanations about power failures and coincidental timing. Started to forget the way those eyes had reflected light, the wrongness of that emergency sign's glow, the perfect silence that had preceded everything. That's when I started noticing the pattern. The router would drop connection for exactly 3 minutes every night at 3 a.m. Just 3 minutes. The logs showed it clearly, connection lost, connection restored, like clockwork. But the failover to 4G never engaged, as if something was anticipating it, blocking both frequencies simultaneously. The interior camera would capture those 3 minutes, but the footage was always corrupted, pixelated to uselessness, shot through with interference patterns that looked almost deliberate in their complexity. My roommate said I was becoming obsessed, said I needed to sleep, to stop checking the door 5 times before bed, to stop reviewing the camera feeds every morning looking for anomalies. He was probably right, but he couldn't explain why sometimes, when we were both home, the smart lock would register an unlock attempt. Failed, always failed, but an attempt nonetheless, even though the logs showed the attempts coming from inside our apartment. The building started feeling wrong. Not dangerous, but wrong. The walls seemed too thin, too permeable. I'd catch myself listening to the apartments around us, trying to determine if the sounds I heard were real, or just the building settling. Once, I could have sworn I heard our doorbell camera's electronic chime, but when I checked my phone, no motion had been detected. No recording existed, just the chime, echoing from nowhere. Last night I woke at 2:58 a.m., precise, like my body had developed a timer. The apartment was dark, but not silent. I could hear the router humming, the refrigerator cycling, all the normal sounds. I lay there, phone in hand, watching the minutes tick toward 3 km. At exactly 3 a.m., the router went silent. No power outage this time, just the router, dying on schedule. I pulled up the camera feed from my phone. The interior camera showed our door clearly. The security bar still wedged in place, the chain fastened. But something was wrong with the image. The longer I stared, the more certain I became. The door was open. Not physically, The chain was attached, the bar was in place, but open somehow, as if the image I was seeing and the reality it represented had become two separate things. Then I saw it move. Not the door, the space around it. The walls themselves seemed to ripple, just for a frame, like video corruption but deliberate. And in that ripple, I saw the hallway beyond, saw that green emergency light flickering to life, saw a figure standing in our apartment looking at the door from the wrong side. The feed stabilized. The door was closed again. Secure. The security bar in place. But I'm not sure anymore which side of the door I'm on. My roommate is still asleep. I can hear him breathing in the next room. At least I'm pretty sure that's him breathing. Pretty sure that's his room. Pretty sure this is still our apartment and not something else wearing its shape. The scratching at the door started again 3 minutes ago. My roommate hasn't woken up. The sounds don't seem to reach him, even though they're loud enough now that I can hear the individual teeth of whatever tool they're using, can hear the whisper of voices coordinating in the hallway, can hear my own breathing synchronized with something else, something just on the other side of the wall. I'm looking at the camera feed now. It shows an empty hallway, shows our closed door, shows everything normal, but I can see them through the peephole. 3 of them now, standing there, watching, waiting. And I'm starting to suspect they're not trying to get in anymore. They're trying to keep something from getting out. Story 4. The smell hit me first. Garlic sautéed in butter, rich and golden, hanging thick in the air like a memory of Sunday dinners I'd never had. But this wasn't Sunday, and I hadn't cooked anything. Neither had my roommates. They were still at work. I stood in our shared house's doorway, keys still dangling from my fingers, trying to process what my senses were telling me. The oven radiated warmth when I placed my hand near it. 2 baking sheets sat in the sink, slick with grease that hadn't yet congealed. Our containers, the mismatched Tupperware collection we'd accumulated over 3 years of communal living, were scattered across the counter like someone had been preparing a feast. But there was no food. Not a crumb, not a morsel, nothing. My first thought was burglar, but nothing was missing. My laptop still sat on the coffee table where I'd left it that morning. The emergency cash we kept in the flour jar remained untouched. Even the good whiskey, the bottle we saved for special occasions, stood unopened on its shelf. I called out, my voice cracking slightly in the stillness. The house swallowed my words without echo. I walked through each room, my footsteps seeming too loud on the hardwood floors, checking windows, testing locks. Everything was secure, exactly as we'd left it. Then I saw the message. It was written in the hallway mirror, traced through the condensation that shouldn't have been there. Our bathroom had been dry since morning. The letters were precise, almost apologetic in their neatness. Sorry about the shower. My skin prickled with a sensation I couldn't name. Not quite fear, not quite confusion, but something that lived in the space between. Someone had been in our house. Someone had cooked, cleaned up after themselves, mostly, used our shower, and left an apology in steam that should have evaporated hours ago. When my roommates came home, we spent the night tearing the place apart. We checked every closet, every crawl space, even pulled down the folding ladder to the attic. We found nothing except our own accumulated junk and a growing sense of violation that settled in our stomachs like bad food. The police officer who came the next morning was polite but clearly unimpressed. She suggested we change our locks, maybe install a security system. She took notes about the non-crime of someone cooking invisible food and taking an unauthorized shower. I could see in her eyes that she thought we were overreacting, maybe even making it up. We changed the locks anyway. For 3 days, nothing happened. We began to relax, to joke about our ghost chef, to rationalize. Maybe it was a confused neighbor with a spare key from the previous tenants. Maybe we'd all somehow failed to notice the cooking smells from next door wafting through our windows. The human mind, we told each other, has a remarkable ability to create patterns from chaos, to see intention where there's only coincidence. Then came the breadcrumbs. The attic room was supposed to be empty, just a storage space where we kept suitcases and Christmas decorations. But there they were, fresh white breadcrumbs scattered across the floor in a rough circle, as if someone had sat there eating a sandwich. The window was locked from the inside. The dust on the sill was undisturbed except for a single handprint, small and delicate, fingers splayed like a child's drawing of the sun. That's when the fear really began to burrow into me, cold and persistent. This wasn't random. This was deliberate. Someone was living in our house, moving through our spaces when we weren't looking, existing in the gaps between our daily routines. I became obsessed with catching them. I bought a container of talcum powder and dusted every threshold, creating invisible borders that would show any trespass. I rigged a small bell to the attic trapdoor, connected to fishing line so thin it was nearly invisible. I set my phone alarm for random times throughout the night: 2:47 a.m., 3:23 a.m., 4:17 a.m., hoping to catch our intruder in the act. My roommates thought I was losing it. They'd already moved on, treating the whole thing as a weird story to tell at parties. But they didn't feel what I felt. That constant sensation of being observed, of sharing space with something that shouldn't be there. They didn't wake up at night to sounds that weren't quite footsteps, weren't quite breathing, but weren't quite nothing either. The bell rang at 4:17 a.m. on a Thursday. Just once. A single clear chime that pulled me from sleep like a fishhook through my consciousness. I lay there, heart hammering, listening to the silence that followed. No footsteps, no creaking. Just the bell's echo dying in the darkness and my own rapid breathing. I grabbed the baseball bat I'd started keeping beside my bed and crept into the hallway. The talcum powder on the attic threshold remained undisturbed, a perfect white line in the moonlight streaming through the window. But the trapdoor was open, just a crack, the bell hanging motionless below it. The ladder squeaked under my weight, each rung a small betrayal announcing my approach. The attic air was different, warmer, humid, carrying a scent I recognized but couldn't place. Hotel soap, maybe. The kind that comes wrapped in paper, promising luxury but delivering only adequate cleanliness. The room was empty, of course, but not untouched. On top of an old suitcase sat a napkin, folded into a perfect square. Hotel quality, crisp white. In the corner, embroidered letters caught the light from my phone. CE. I picked it up with trembling fingers. Underneath was a photograph I'd never seen before. Our house, taken from across the street, but something was wrong with it. It took me a moment to realize what. In the attic window, barely visible, was a figure. Just a shadow, really. A suggestion of a person. But they were waving. I stumbled backward, the photo fluttering to the floor. When I picked it up again, the figure was gone. Just our house, ordinary and unremarkable. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, or the next. By the third day, I was seeing things. Shadows that moved wrong, reflections that lagged a half-second behind, doors I was certain I'd closed standing slightly ajar. My roommate staged what they called an intervention, but what felt like an ambush, suggesting I stay with my parents for a while, get some help, talk to someone. I wanted to show them the photo, but I'd lost it, or hidden it. I couldn't remember which, and that scared me more than anything else. The breaking point came 2 weeks later. I'd been sleeping in the living room, unable to bear my bedroom's oppressive stillness. I woke to find the coffee table moved 3 inches to the left. Such a small thing, but I knew it had been centered when I fell asleep. On it sat a mug of tea, still steaming, and a note in handwriting that looked almost like mine, but not quite. "You're not sleeping enough." I packed a bag and left that morning. Moved in with my cousin across town, told everyone I needed a change of scenery. I didn't mention the text I got that evening from an unknown number. "The attic misses you." But here's the thing that really gets me, the detail that makes me question everything. I went back once, 3 months later, to get the rest of my things. My old roommates were out, and I let myself in with the key I'd never returned. The house felt different, lighter somehow, less oppressive, normal. In my old room, I found a journal on the nightstand. My journal filled with my handwriting, documenting everything I've just told you. But the last entry was dated 3 days after I'd left, describing events I didn't remember, couldn't have experienced. It talked about finally meeting CE. According to the journal, they'd been living in our attic for years, existing in the spaces between walls, the gaps under floorboards, the forgotten corners where dust gathers and spiders spin. They were running from something, the entry said, though it didn't specify what. They only came out when the house was empty, living on the edges of our lives, borrowing our shower, cooking meals that existed only as scents and memories. The entry described a conversation we'd had, me and this impossible person, sitting in the attic at 4:17 a.m., sharing tea and discussing the nature of existence. They told me they were sorry for the intrusion, but some people, they said, are meant to live parallel lives, never quite touching, but always aware of each other's presence. They said I understood because I was one of them, had always been one of them, just hadn't realized it yet. The last line of the entry reads, "I'm thinking of staying in the attic for a while. The view is better from up here." I put the journal back and left. I haven't returned since. Sometimes late at night I catch myself wondering if I ever really left at all. If maybe I'm still there in that attic, writing entries in a journal I don't remember keeping. Sometimes I smell garlic cooking when I'm alone in my apartment, or find breadcrumbs in rooms I haven't entered, or see CE embroidered on napkins that shouldn't exist. My cousin says I've been sleeping better lately, that I seem more like myself. But yesterday she mentioned something strange. She's been finding talcum powder on her doorsteps, little white lines that appear overnight. And last night, she swears she heard a bell ringing somewhere in the walls, just once at 4:17 a.m. I told her it was probably nothing. Old houses make odd sounds. The mind plays tricks. But I've started leaving tea out before bed, 2 cups instead of 1. Sometimes in the morning, both are empty. Sometimes I can almost remember drinking them, sitting across from someone whose face I can't quite see, discussing the spaces between things, the places where parallel lines finally meet. The napkin is still in my pocket, or at least, I think it is. When I reach for it, my fingers find only empty space, but I can feel its weight, the rough texture of the embroidered letters. CE could be anyone, could be initials, could be an abbreviation, could be me. I've started a new journal. The handwriting looks almost like mine, but not quite. It documents things I'm pretty sure I haven't done yet, places I might have been, conversations that feel like memories of dreams. Sometimes I catch myself writing in it, but when I look down, the pages are blank. My roommates from the old house don't remember me anymore. I called once, and they said they'd never had a third roommate, that the attic had always been empty except for storage. They mentioned something about finding old journals up there, though, filled with stories about someone who might have lived there once, someone who existed in the margins, in the spaces between real and not real. They said they leave tea out sometimes, just in case. I think about going back, climbing those stairs, ringing that bell. Sometimes I wake up at 4:17 a.m. in my cousin's apartment, and I'm not sure if I ever left at all, or if I'm still there, in that attic, writing stories about escape, about parallel lives that never quite touch. The smell of garlic follows me everywhere now, and sometimes, in mirrors steamed with showers I didn't take, I see messages I don't remember writing. Come home. The attic is waiting. Story 5. Text messages always come at 3:17 a.m. I've been awake for most of them, staring at the ceiling while the phone screen illuminates my bedroom with its sickly blue glow. The older man from the bar, I never learned his real name, everyone just called him Doc, sends the same variation each time. Exclusive gathering tonight or select group meeting or private game. Invitation only. The messages delete themselves after 30 seconds, like smoke dissipating in darkness, but I've memorized their cadence, their insistent pull. It started 8 months ago, before everything shifted, before the air in this city began to taste like copper pennies, left too long in the rain. Doc had approached me at Murphy's, the dive bar where I used to unwind after my warehouse shifts. He moved with the fluid confidence of someone who'd never been refused anything, his gray suit impeccable despite the bar's grimy atmosphere. His fingers, I remember his fingers most clearly, were impossibly long, each joint articulated like a pianist's, though when he set his whiskey down, The glass clinked with unnecessary force. He'd invited me to what he called a friendly card game. Just poker, he assured me, though his smile revealed teeth that seemed too numerous for his mouth. Selected participants only. A house in the suburbs, away from prying eyes. The way he said prying eyes made my stomach contract into a cold fist. I declined politely, claimed an early shift, though we both knew the warehouse ran 24/7, and my schedule was as flexible as wet clay. Doc's expression never changed, but the temperature around our corner of the bar dropped several degrees. He patted my shoulder, his hand was fever-hot through my shirt, and said he'd keep me in mind for future opportunities. That same night, my coworker vanished. We'd walked out together, me and him, heading to our respective cars in the employee lot. I remember him mentioning something about finally having enough saved to visit his sister in Portland. His Toyota was still there the next morning, driver's door ajar, keys in the ignition, battery dead from the interior light staying on all night. Management said he'd called in, said he'd had a family emergency and moved out of state. But his locker still had his lunch in it, tuna sandwich going rancid in aluminum foil, and his apartment landlord said he'd paid 3 months in advance. The warehouse hired a replacement within the week. Nobody mentioned him again. I changed my route home after that, adding 20 minutes to avoid passing the address Doc had given me. But curiosity is a parasitic thing, feeding on avoidance until it swells beyond containment. One Saturday afternoon, broad daylight with families walking dogs and kids riding bikes, I drove past the house. It squatted on a corner lot like a toad made of brick and bad intentions. The lawn was manicured with obsessive precision, each blade of grass uniform height, though I never saw anyone tending it. The windows were normal then, clear glass reflecting the neighborhood's mundane weekend activities. Just a house, just a basement with a poker table probably, men drinking beer and losing money, complaining about their wives and jobs. But the door was wrong. Painted red, but not the cheerful red of welcome. This was the red of something internal, something that should stay hidden beneath skin. And the doorknob, brass and gleaming, was installed backwards. The lock mechanism faced outward. I kept driving. The text messages started a month later. Always at 3:17 a.m., always deletion after 30 seconds. I never responded, but I never blocked the number either. Some primitive part of my brain insisted I needed to know when they came, needed to track their frequency like a seismologist monitoring tremors before an earthquake. 3 months passed in this holding pattern. Work, home, careful avoidance of Murphy's and that suburban street. The messages continued their clockwork arrival. My sleep fractured into fragments, my body training itself to wake at 3:16, to wait for the phone's buzz. Then I saw the documentary. It was background noise while I ate leftover Chinese food, some true crime series about unsolved disappearances in the Midwest. The camera panned across a crime scene, yellow tape and evidence markers, investigators in white suits moving like ghosts through someone's garage. And there, in the unfocused background, standing next to a detective, Doc, same gray suit, same 2 long fingers, now wrapped around a coffee cup. Same smile that suggested he knew where all the bodies were buried because he'd drawn the maps himself. The narrator droned on about mysterious circumstances, about patterns the FBI couldn't quite connect, about basements that looked normal until you noticed the floor was 6 inches higher than it should be. I rewound, paused, zoomed in on my laptop screen until the pixels dissolved into meaningless colored squares. But I knew it was him. The way he stood, the way he held his head tilted slightly left, as if listening to music only he could hear. The documentary was 2 years old. The disappearances it covered spanned a decade. That night's message came with an addendum. We miss your presence. I started taking different routes everywhere. Work, grocery store, gym. Never the same path twice. Installed new locks. Then installed more locks. Then installed cameras that fed to my phone. The footage showed nothing unusual, just the occasional cat or raccoon. But sometimes the timestamp would jump. 3:14 a.m. to 3:18 a.m. 4 minutes of missing tape that the tech support said was impossible, must be user error. My dreams grew strange and viscous. I'd be sitting at a felt-covered table, cards in my hand that kept changing, aces becoming faces I recognized but couldn't name, suits morphing from hearts to something that looked like small, screaming mouths. Doc would be dealing, his fingers moving too fast to track, and the other players would have no faces at all, just smooth skin stretched over skull shapes. They'd bet things that weren't money, memories, sensations, the ability to distinguish between waking and sleeping. And I'd want to fold, to push back from the table and run, but my legs would be gone, dissolved into the chair, and Doc would smile and say the game wasn't over until the house decided it was over. I'd wake gasping, sheets soaked with sweat that smelled like formaldehyde. Last weekend, against every instinct screaming in my head, I drove past the house again. The windows were frosted now, that privacy glass that lets light in but turns everything beyond into abstract shapes. Cameras perched on the corners like mechanical spiders, their red recording lights steady as arterial pulses. The red door remained, but now it had a small window at eye level. One-way glass, the kind used in interrogation rooms. I parked 3 blocks away and walked back, hood up despite the warm evening. The sidewalk felt soft under my feet, as if the concrete was just a thin shell over something organic and breathing. Every house I passed seemed to lean away from Doc's place, a subtle architectural recoil that you'd only notice if you were looking for it. As I approached, the front door opened. Nobody emerged. It just hung there, ajar, revealing a darkness that seemed too thick for the hour, too absolute for a house with lights visible through the frosted windows. The darkness had weight, had texture, like looking into water so deep that pressure alone would crush you before you ever reached bottom. From inside, barely audible, came the sound of cards being shuffled. The specific whisper of paper against paper, but also something else. A rustling that reminded me of insects moving under dead leaves, of things that shouldn't be disturbed being disturbed anyway. I stood frozen on the sidewalk. A rational part of my mind, growing smaller by the second, insisted I should run. Call the police. Call anyone. But my feet wouldn't respond, and the darkness in that doorway seemed to pulse with invitation, with promise, with threats dressed up as opportunities. Then I heard it, my coworker's laugh. Distinctive, unmistakable, that wheeze whistle combination from years of cigarettes. Coming from inside the house, from what had to be the basement, though it sounded simultaneously near and impossibly distant, as if the architecture inside operated on different physical laws than the outside suggested. The laugh cut off abruptly, replaced by Doc's voice, smooth as oil on water. We're waiting for one more player. The door began to close, slow and deliberate, and just before it latched, I saw them. Eyes, dozens of them, reflecting from the darkness like stars in a void, all focused on where I stood. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs shook, ran past my parked car and kept going, ran until the suburban streets gave way to commercial districts, and then to the industrial area near the warehouse. Only when I reached the familiar chain-link fences and loading docks did I stop, hands on knees, gasping. My phone buzzed. 3:17 a.m., though my watch said it was only 9:30 p.m. Next time, you won't be able to refuse. The message didn't delete itself. It sits there still, in my phone, immutable despite my attempts to remove it. I factory reset the device twice, changed carriers, bought a new phone entirely. The message transfers itself, appears in my inbox like it was always there, waiting. I've started seeing them in my peripheral vision. The players from my dreams, faceless figures standing at bus stops, sitting in parked cars, browsing in grocery stores. When I turn to look directly, they're just normal people, but I can feel their attention like thumbtacks pressed into my spine. The warehouse feels different now too. Shadows pool in corners where the overhead lights should reach. My coworkers avoid me, conversations dying when I approach, their eyes sliding away as if they've been told something I haven't. Sometimes I hear cards shuffling in the ventilation system, that distinctive riffle and bridge, though maintenance says the ducts are clear. Doc's messages have evolved. They include photos now, not of people or places, but of objects. A chair with leather straps. A table with grooves carved into its surface, patterns that hurt to perceive directly. A deck of cards where each card shows the same thing. A door, painted red, with the knob facing the wrong direction. I know what this is building toward. The invitation that isn't an invitation. The game that isn't a game. The basement that's just a basement until you realize the floor is too high and the walls are too thick and the sounds from inside don't match the number of people you can see. But here's what terrifies me most. I've started wanting to accept. Not the surface want of curiosity or the middle want of ending the suspense. This is deeper, cellular, as if something in my DNA recognizes something in that house, in Doc's two long fingers, in the darkness beyond that red door. As if I've always been a player, just temporarily displaced, and the game has been going on without me, incomplete, waiting for my return. Last night I stood outside my apartment for 3 hours, keys in hand, unable to make myself go inside, because I knew with certainty that bypassed logic, that when I opened my door, I'd see a felt-covered table in my living room. Doc sitting there, dealing cards to faces I'd recognize but couldn't name. My co-worker smiling with too many teeth, pushing chips across the table that looked like small white bones. When I finally entered, the apartment was normal, empty, quiet. But there was a playing card on my kitchen counter, the ace of something. The suit kept changing when I wasn't looking directly at it. Hearts becoming diamonds, becoming shapes that don't exist in standard decks, symbols that made my eyes water. I picked it up. It was warm, pulse warm, and heavier than paper should be. On the back, in Doc's handwriting, though I'd never seen him write anything, were 3 words. Your move next. The card is in my pocket now as I write this. I can feel it there, generating heat like a living thing, like a promise, like a countdown. Every few minutes I touch it to make sure it's still singular, still just one card, though sometimes my fingers tell me there are 2, then 3, then a full deck materializing 1 card at a time. The sun is setting. My phone says it's 8:43 p.m., but the light outside suggests 3:17 a.m., that specific gray-black of deep night walking toward dawn. I know where I'm supposed to go, know that the red door will be open, that the basement stairs will creak in a pattern that sounds like my name, that the felt table will have exactly 1 empty chair. I know that if I go, I'll learn what happened to my coworker, learn what those investigators were really looking for in that documentary, learn why the floor in some basements is 6 inches higher than it should be. I know that if I don't go, the game will come to me. The table will manifest in spaces I thought were safe. Doc's fingers will deal cards in my dreams until dreams become indistinguishable from waking. The faceless players will multiply until every person I see is wearing that smooth skin mask, until I'm the only one with features, marked and obvious and alone. My phone buzzes. A new message, though it's not 3:17 a.m., though it's not time yet, though time itself feels negotiable lately. The house decides when the game ends. I stand up, legs moving without conscious command. The card in my pocket has become a full deck. I can feel their weight, their shape, their eagerness to be shuffled and dealt and played. The red door is waiting. It's always been waiting. And I realize, with the clarity of someone stepping off a cliff and noticing the ground was never there to begin with, that I've already been playing. Every refusal, every avoidance, every moment of resistance, just another hand in a game where the house always wins. Because the house doesn't just decide when the game ends, the house decides if it ever started at all. Story 6. The keys felt wrong in my hand. Too heavy, too cold, like they'd been sitting in a freezer instead of my friend's kitchen counter where he'd left them. I stood at the entrance of his triplex, late afternoon shadows already creeping across the hardwood floor beyond the threshold. 3 floors of empty house stretched above me, and for a moment, I wondered why anyone would need this much space for themselves. Just water the plants, check the mail, make sure nothing goes wrong. Simple enough instructions for 2 weeks of house sitting. The compensation was generous, suspiciously so for such basic tasks. but I wasn't in a position to question easy money. The place smelled of furniture polish and something else. Something organic and faintly sweet, like fruit left too long in a bowl. I dragged my suitcase across the threshold, the wheels catching on the doorframe with a sound that echoed through the empty rooms. The acoustics were strange here, sounds seeming to travel in directions they shouldn't, bouncing off walls at odd angles. I found the guest room on the ground floor, just off the main hallway. It was perfectly adequate. Queen bed with crisp white sheets, dresser, nightstand, attached bathroom. The kind of impersonal space designed for temporary occupation. I set my bag down and noticed how the afternoon light barely penetrated the room despite the large window. The glass seemed thick, almost clouded, as if years of condensation had left permanent marks between the panes. That first evening passed quietly. I ordered takeout, watched television in the living room, checked that all the doors were locked. The house made the usual settling sounds, pipes ticking, wood adjusting to temperature changes. Normal house sounds. I told myself this repeatedly as I prepared for bed, though something about the rhythm of those sounds seemed too regular, too deliberate, like someone learning to mimic what a house should sound like. At 2 a.m., the crash yanked me from sleep with such violence that for a moment I couldn't remember where I was. The sound had come from directly above, not just a bump or a creak, but a sustained grinding noise, as if someone was dragging a wardrobe across the floor. The ceiling actually seemed to vibrate, dust motes drifting down in the pale light from the street lamp outside. I lay frozen, heart hammering against my ribs, listening. The dragging stopped, replaced by silence so complete it felt manufactured. No settling sounds, no pipe ticks, nothing. Just my own breathing, too loud in the darkness. Then footsteps, slow, measured, moving from one end of the floor above to the other. Not the random pattern of someone searching for something, but deliberate pacing, back and forth, back and forth. I grabbed my phone, activated the flashlight, and crept toward the stairs. Each step on the carpeted tread seemed to announce my presence, despite my efforts at stealth. The second-floor hallway stretched before me, every door along its length standing wide open, not slightly ajar, not carelessly left unclosed, but deliberately, uniformly open, as if on display. The flashlight beam swept across each room: master bedroom, home office, bathroom, second guest room. Everything in perfect order, bed made, chairs tucked under desks, towels hanging straight, no wardrobe out of place, no furniture disturbed, no explanation for the grinding sound that had shaken the house. I stood in the hallway, phone trembling slightly in my hand, when I heard it. Breathing that wasn't mine. Not from any of the rooms, but from the hallway itself, as if the space between the walls had developed lungs. I backed toward the stairs, keeping the light trained ahead, and the breathing seemed to follow, maintaining a constant distance. Back in the guest room, I locked the door and pushed the dresser against it. Sleep was impossible. I sat on the edge of the bed, lights on, listening to the house around me. At 3 a.m., the knocking started, not on my door, but inside the wall behind the bed. 3 measured raps. Pause. 3 more. The rhythm never varied, mechanical in its precision. When I pressed my ear to the wall, I could hear something else between the knocks. A whispered counting, though in what language I couldn't tell. By 4 a.m., the knocking had become a conversation. The wall behind me would sound 3 times, and another wall, sometimes to the left, sometimes the right, once from the ceiling, would answer. The patterns grew more complex, like a code being worked out in real time. I moved to the couch in the living room, but the sound followed, always in whatever wall was closest to my head. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. In the gray morning light, the house looked normal, even welcoming. I walked through each room, searching for any explanation. That's when I noticed the carpet in the second-floor hallway. The pile was compressed in 2 parallel lines, running from the master suite at one end all the way to the guest room at the other. The marks were old, worn deep into the fibers by repetition. Something heavy had been dragged along this path many, many times. In the master bedroom, I found more marks. 4 deep indentations in the carpet where furniture legs had rested, probably for years. A wardrobe or armoire, by the spacing. But the piece itself was gone, and the marks led to the door, joining the drag marks in the hallway. I spent the morning searching the house more thoroughly. In a drawer in the kitchen, beneath old takeout menus and rubber bands, I found a yellowed piece of paper. The handwriting was cramped, urgent. Sleeping there is disrespectful. You wouldn't understand. Use the right room or don't sleep at all. There was no signature, no date. The paper felt brittle, as if it might crumble at too firm a touch. I set it on the counter and stared at it, trying to decode its meaning. The right room. Which was the right room? That second night, I decided to test a theory. I made a show of preparing for bed in the ground floor guest room again, brushing teeth, changing clothes, turning off lights. But instead of getting into bed, I crept upstairs to the master suite on the 3rd floor. The room felt different from the others, warmer somehow, as if it retained heat better. The bed was enormous, with posts that nearly touched the ceiling. I slipped under the covers and waited. Midnight passed, then 1 a.m. At 2 a.m., I held my breath, but no crash came, no dragging sounds, no footsteps. The house remained silent, except for those normal, irregular settling sounds I'd missed so much the night before. I actually began to drift off. Then I heard it. The guest room door on the ground floor opening. Not forced, not broken, but opening with the specific sound of a handle turning, hinges moving. Footsteps entered the room below, heavy and shuffling. They moved around the space, pausing here and there as if searching. The closet door opened. Drawers slid out. I lay rigid in the 3rd floor bed, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. Whatever was down there was looking for something. Looking for me. After what felt like hours but was probably minutes, the footsteps left the guest room and began ascending the stairs. Slow, methodical, checking each room on the 2nd floor. Doors opened and closed with careful precision. Then the footsteps started up to the 3rd floor. I could track their progress by the creaking of each individual step. They paused at the landing and I heard breathing, labored, thick, as if through liquid. The master bedroom door was closed but not locked. I watched the handle, waiting for it to turn. Instead, the footsteps retreated. Back down to the 2nd floor, back down to the 1st, and then nothing. The house fell silent again. But it was a different silence, almost approving. The next morning, I found my suitcase moved. Not drastically, just shifted a few feet from where I'd left it in the guest room. The dresser I'd pushed against the door was back in its original position. On the bed, which I definitely hadn't slept in, the covers were turned down, and there was an indentation in the pillow. The shape of a head, but wrong somehow. Too large, too deep, as if something much heavier than a human head had rested there. I moved my things to the master suite permanently. Each night, I made sure to leave the door slightly open, not wide, just a crack, enough for the hallway to see in, or breathe. The sounds continued, footsteps, dragging, knocking, but they never came to the 3rd floor when I left that door open. It was as if I'd finally understood the rules. On the 5th night, curiosity got the better of me. I set up my phone to record video in the 2nd floor hallway, positioned to capture the length of the corridor. The next morning, I reviewed the footage. At 2 a.m. exactly, all the doors along the hallway opened simultaneously. Not blown by wind, not pushed. They simply swung open in perfect synchronization. Then, for 3 hours, nothing. At 5 a.m., they all closed again, just as simultaneously. But there was something else. If I enhanced the brightness and looked carefully, I could see impressions appearing in the carpet. The same drag marks I'd noticed, but fresh ones, appearing in real time as if an invisible weight was being pulled along the floor. The compression would appear, hold for a moment, then fade, only to reappear a few feet further along. Whatever was making them was methodical, patient, following the exact same path each time. I began to notice other patterns. Every morning, certain objects in the house would be subtly rearranged. Picture frames angled differently. Books shifted on shelves. chairs pulled out from tables by precise inches. Never dramatic enough to be vandalism, always just enough to be noticed if you were paying attention. The house was communicating, but I couldn't understand the language. On the seventh night, I broke protocol. Instead of sleeping in the master bedroom with the door cracked, I stayed awake in the living room, lights off, watching the staircase. At 2 a.m., the now familiar crash echoed from the second floor. I forced myself to remain still, to observe rather than investigate. The dragging sound began, but this time I could track its movement by sound alone. From the far end of the second floor, approaching the stairs, then descending. Not footsteps, but that grinding, dragging noise coming down toward me. I could hear wood groaning under weight, carpet fibers tearing. It reached the ground floor and stopped. The silence stretched out, pregnant with possibility. Then I heard breathing, but not from any specific direction. The entire room seemed to inhale and exhale, walls expanding and contracting minutely. In the darkness, I could swear I saw the shape of furniture that wasn't there. A massive wardrobe, standing in the middle of the room, its doors slowly opening. I closed my eyes, counted to 10, and when I opened them, the shape was gone. But the breathing continued, and now it had a wet quality, like lungs filled with fluid. I stood slowly, not running, but walking with deliberate calm to the stairs. Up to the third floor, to the master bedroom. I made sure to leave the door open just a crack. The breathing followed me to the doorway, but no further. I heard what sounded like acknowledgement. Not words, but a sound that conveyed meaning nonetheless. Approval, maybe, or disappointment that I'd learned too quickly. On the 10th night, I found another note. This one was newer, the paper white and crisp, tucked under the pillow in the master bedroom. The handwriting was different, my friend's handwriting. You figured it out faster than most. The house chooses who sleeps where. Respect its choices, and it respects you. The previous owner learned too late. He's the one still moving furniture, still trying to claim the wrong room. I wanted to call my friend, to demand answers, but something told me he wouldn't answer, or couldn't. The trip he'd taken, was it real? Or was this just another test, another rule I had to learn? The sounds continue each night. The dragging, the breathing, the knocking in the walls. But they don't threaten anymore. They're just part of the house's routine, like a heartbeat or the tide. Sometimes I wonder if I'm becoming part of that routine too. Another sound in the walls for the next house sitter to puzzle over. Last night, I heard something new. Not from inside the house, but from outside. Someone walking up the front path, keys jingling. The doorknob turned, but the door didn't open. Instead, I heard a sigh, then footsteps walking away. In the morning, I found fresh drag marks in the front garden, leading from the door to the sidewalk and disappearing into the street. Tonight is my last night. My friend returns tomorrow, supposedly. I've left the master bedroom door open as always, but I've also left the guest room door open and the second floor doors, and even the front door stands ajar. The house needs to breathe, to move, to rearrange itself according to rules I'll never fully understand. As I write this, I can hear furniture being dragged upstairs. Not violently, but carefully, purposefully. The wardrobe is returning to its place, I think. Or maybe it never left. Maybe it's always been moving, always been searching for the right room, and we're just temporary obstacles in its path. Tomorrow I'll leave, and someone else will eventually take my place. They'll choose the wrong room first. Everyone does. They'll hear the sounds, feel the breathing walls, find the notes. Maybe they'll figure it out like I did. Maybe they won't. The house will endure either way. It always has. The corridor is breathing now, deep and satisfied. I've learned to breathe with it, to match its rhythm. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever really leave, or if some part of me will remain. Another sound in the walls, another set of footsteps for the next person to fear. The wardrobe has stopped moving. The silence feels like a held breath. I think I'll sleep well tonight. Story 7. The fluorescent lights in the lab parking lot cast everything in a sickly yellow hue that made my skin look jaundiced. I'd stayed late again. debugging code that seemed to writhe and change every time I looked away from the screen. My eyes burned, and the migraine that had been building all day pulsed behind my temples like something alive trying to claw its way out. That's when I first noticed the white compact. It sat idling at the bus stop, exhaust forming small clouds in the November air. Nothing unusual about that, except for how the driver never moved. Not once. Just a dark silhouette behind tinted glass, facing my direction. I pulled my jacket tighter and started walking, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the empty office buildings like a countdown. At the first corner, the car's engine hummed to life. It rolled forward, slow and deliberate, matching my pace exactly. When I crossed the street, it turned, circling the block like a shark testing the waters. My apartment building stood 3 blocks away, but it might as well have been 3 miles. The street stretched before me, shadows pooling in doorways and alleys, each one a potential hiding spot for whatever game this was. I ducked into my building's parking garage through the pedestrian entrance, keeping my hand wrapped around the gate control in my pocket. The concrete walls seemed to press in, fluorescent tubes flickering overhead in a stuttering rhythm that made the shadows dance. Behind me, I heard the car pull up to the curb, engine idling. The headlights dimmed to parking lights, 2 amber eyes watching through the chain-link fence. My hands shook as I pulled out my keys and aimed them at a random sedan. The panic button felt cold under my thumb. I pressed it, and the garage exploded with sound, alarms shrieking, echoing off concrete until it became a physical thing that pressed against my eardrums. The security guard appeared within seconds, flashlight beam cutting through the chaos. When I looked back, the compact was gone, leaving only the ghost of exhaust fumes hanging in the air. But it came back. Every night after that, it would appear somewhere along my route home. Sometimes at the bus stop, sometimes already parked outside my building. Always at a calculated distance, close enough to be seen but far enough to maintain plausible deniability. The driver never emerged, never moved, just sat there behind that tinted glass like a mannequin. I started varying my route, leaving at different times, even taking ride shares instead of walking. It didn't matter. The white compact would materialize somewhere along the way, patient as death. My coworkers began noticing the dark circles under my eyes, the way I'd flinch whenever a car door slammed in the parking lot. They suggested I talk to someone, get help. But how could I explain this without sounding completely unhinged? The building administrator was a thin man who smelled of cigarettes and coffee. His office sat in the basement, surrounded by monitors showing feeds from every camera in the building. I told him about my concerns, keeping my voice steady, professional. He nodded, fingers dancing across the keyboard as he pulled up footage from the garage. The timestamp showed 3 nights ago, 11:47 p.m. There I was on the screen, walking through the pedestrian entrance. The gate closed behind me, and then nothing. 4 frames of static, like someone had taken scissors to the film. When the image returned, the vehicle gate was closing, but no car had entered. The administrator rewound it, played it again. Same result. 4 frames of corruption, at the exact moment the gate had opened for a vehicle that didn't exist. He suggested it might be electrical interference, maybe from a cell tower or power surge. His explanation sounded hollow, words meant to fill space rather than provide answers. I could see it in his eyes. He was unsettled too, though he'd never admit it. We both stared at those 4 missing frames, and I wondered what horror had been edited out of reality. Sleep became impossible. I'd lie in bed listening to every sound from the street below, waiting for the familiar hum of that engine. Sometimes I'd hear it, or thought I did, and I'd creep to the window to peer through the blinds. The street would be empty, but the feeling of being watched never left. It clung to me like a second skin, cold and suffocating. I installed security cameras in my apartment, tiny wireless things that connected to my phone. Every night I'd review the footage, looking for something, anything that would prove I wasn't losing my mind. The videos showed nothing unusual, just me, pacing, checking locks, staring at windows. But sometimes, in the corner of a frame, there'd be a shadow that didn't quite match anything in the room. a darkness that seemed to have depth, dimension, like something standing just outside the camera's field of view. My dreams, when I managed to sleep, were filled with endless highways and white cars that multiplied every time I looked away. I'd wake, gasping, sheets soaked with sweat, the taste of exhaust fumes somehow lingering in my mouth. The line between waking and sleeping began to blur. I'd catch myself at work, staring at my reflection in the black computer screen, not recognizing the hollow-eyed stranger looking back. The breaking point came on a Thursday. I'd worked late again, hoping that if I waited long enough, whoever was in that car would get bored, give up, move on to easier prey. The office was tomb quiet, just the hum of servers and the occasional tick of cooling metal. When I finally left, the parking lot was empty except for my car and the security guard's truck. No white compact, no idling engine, just blessed emptiness. The relief was so intense it made me dizzy. I actually laughed, the sound echoing off the buildings like a madman's cackle. Maybe it was over. Maybe whoever it was had found someone else to torment. I walked to my car with something almost resembling confidence. Keys ready, breathing steady. That's when I saw it. Not the car, the driver. They stood beside my vehicle, tall and motionless, wearing clothes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. No features were visible in the darkness under their hood, just a void where a face should be. We stood there, maybe 20 feet apart, neither moving. The air between us felt thick, charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. Then they raised one hand and waved. Slow, deliberate. The gesture of someone who knew they had all the time in the world. I ran, abandoned my car and ran, feet pounding pavement, lungs burning. Behind me, no footsteps followed, no engine roared to life. Just silence, which was somehow worse. I called a rideshare from 3 blocks away, huddled in the doorway of a closed coffee shop, watching every shadow for movement. When I finally made it home, I barricaded the door with furniture and sat in the corner of my living room with every light on, laptop open, recording everything. If something happened to me, I wanted proof. Evidence. The hours crawled by, each minute an eternity of waiting for something to happen. At 3 a.m., my security cameras glitched. All of them, simultaneously. 4 frames of static, just like the garage footage. When the feeds returned, everything looked normal. Except, the furniture I'd used to barricade the door had been moved back to its original position. Perfectly, as if I'd never touched it. I watched myself on the recordings, sitting in the corner, staring at nothing. But in those missing 4 frames, something had been in my apartment. Something had moved through my space, rearranged my reality, and left no trace except the sick certainty in my gut that I was no longer alone. The next morning, I called in sick to work, and the next, and the next. I stopped leaving the apartment altogether, surviving on delivery food left outside my door. The white compact still appeared every night, parked in different spots but always visible from at least one of my windows. Sometimes I'd see the dark figure standing beside it, sometimes inside, always watching. I started researching, diving deep into forums and databases, looking for similar experiences. I found fragments, stories about white cars that appeared before disappearances, about corrupted footage and missing time, about things that wore human shapes but weren't. Each account ended the same way. The person either vanished or stopped posting entirely, their last messages increasingly frantic and disjointed. My own messages were starting to look the same. I could see it when I reread them. The paranoid rambling, the jumps in logic, the desperate need to make someone, anyone, believe me. But what if that was the point? What if whatever was in that white compact fed on this kind of fear, this dissolution of reality and reason? What if I was being seasoned, prepared, made ready for something worse than death? The cameras in my apartment now showed those 4-frame glitches every night, sometimes multiple times. I'd wake up in different rooms with no memory of moving. Objects would be rearranged in subtle ways, a book turned spine in, a picture frame angled differently, a coffee mug moved 3 inches to the left. Never anything dramatic, just enough to let me know that the boundaries of my space, my reality, were permeable. Last night, I found something that made my blood freeze. In reviewing the security footage, I saw myself sleeping on the couch. Normal enough, except for my eyes. They were open, wide open, staring directly at the camera. For 3 hours, I lay there perfectly still, eyes unblinking, looking at something beyond the lens. When I finally moved, sitting up and rubbing my face, I had no memory of being awake at all. The white compact is outside right now. I can see it from my window, parked under a streetlight that keeps flickering in a pattern that almost seems like Morse code. The driver is standing beside it again, that void where their face should be turned up toward my apartment. They're holding something, a manila envelope, thick with papers. Even from here, I can see my name written on it in handwriting that looks exactly like mine. I know I should stay inside, lock the doors, close the blinds, pretend I don't see them. But the walls of this apartment feel thinner every day, the boundary between inside and outside dissolving like ice in water. Those 4-frame glitches are getting longer. 8 frames now, sometimes 12. Entire seconds where reality takes a coffee break and something else slides into the gap. My laptop camera just turned on by itself. The recording light blinks red, but when I check the security app, it shows no active recording. I cover it with tape, but I can still feel it watching. Everything is watching. The apartment itself has become an eye, and I'm the foreign object it's trying to blink away. The figure by the car is still holding that envelope, still waiting, and the terrible thing is, I'm starting to understand that they're not the threat. They're the messenger, the invitation. Whatever's been happening in those missing frames, whatever's been rearranging my reality piece by piece, that's the real presence. The white compact is just the doorway. I'm going downstairs. I have to know what's in that envelope, even though every instinct screams against it. Maybe it's instructions. Maybe it's an explanation. Maybe it's just blank pages that will somehow contain everything I'm afraid to know. The door to my apartment stands open, though I know I locked it. The hallway beyond stretches longer than it should, perspective skewing like a funhouse mirror. Somewhere in the distance, I can hear the white compact's engine idling, a sound that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I step into the hallway, and for 4 frames, no, 4 seconds, no, 4 minutes, I'm somewhere else. Somewhere with too many angles and not enough light, where white cars drive on roads that loop back on themselves and the drivers all have voids for faces. Then I'm back, standing at the building's entrance, the envelope somehow already in my hands. My name is on it, in my handwriting, but I didn't write it. Inside are photographs, dozens of them, all of me, taken from angles that should be impossible, from inside my walls, from beneath my floor, from somewhere behind my own eyes. In each one, there's something wrong with my shadow. It has too many arms, or not enough, or it's facing the wrong direction entirely. The last photo shows me standing next to a white compact, keys in my hand, that void where my face should be. On the back, in that same handwriting that's mine but isn't, are 2 words: welcome home. I look up from the photograph, and the white compact is gone. But I can feel it now, humming beneath my skin, idling in the spaces between my thoughts. My reflection in the glass door shows someone who looks like me, moves like me, but whose shadow falls in impossible directions. I walk back to my apartment, or maybe I'm driven. It's hard to tell anymore. The security cameras will show me entering normally, closing the door, going about my routine. But there will be 4 frames missing. There always are. And in those missing frames, I'm everywhere and nowhere, driving a white compact through streets that exist in the gaps between seconds, looking for the next person who stays too late at work, whose reality is thin enough to notice us watching. The cycle continues. It has to. After all, someone needs to deliver the invitations. Story 8. The back door was ajar when I returned from Chicago. Not open, just resting against the frame, the latch disengaged, as if someone had closed it carefully from the inside and walked away without bothering to turn the lock. The kind of detail you might miss if you weren't looking for it. I was looking. 3 days I'd been gone. 3 days of a business trip I couldn't remember agreeing to, staying in hotels that smelled of industrial cleaner and talking to people whose faces blurred together by the second meeting. The flight back had been delayed, and I'd arrived home after midnight, exhausted and irritable, wanting nothing more than my own bed and the familiar creak of my own floorboards. But there was that door, and suddenly sleep seemed very far away. I stood in the driveway for a long moment, my suitcase still in hand, listening. The neighborhood was quiet in that particular way that only happens after midnight in the suburbs, a silence so complete it feels manufactured, like someone has pressed mute on the world. No dogs barking, no distant traffic, just the faint electrical hum of streetlights and the occasional rustle of wind through the oak tree in the neighbor's yard. Nothing moved inside my house. I pushed the door open with my foot, keeping my distance, half expecting something to come rushing out. Nothing did. The kitchen looked exactly as I'd left it, clean and orderly, the dish towel still folded over the oven handle. But the air felt different, occupied somehow, used, like the empty space between people in an elevator, charged with recent presence. It wasn't until morning that I found the other signs. The laundry room first. I'd started a load before leaving, and the clothes had been sitting in the washer for 3 days, probably mildewed and ruined. But when I opened the door, the drum was empty, bone dry. More than that, there were faint watermarks along the rubber seal, and dark smudges that could have been dirt or oil. Someone had run the machine, used it. The thought made my skin crawl in a way I couldn't quite articulate. The dish soap was wrong too. I keep it next to the sink, bottle facing left, spout closed. Now it faced right, and the spout was lifted at a 45-degree angle, like someone had used it mid-task and forgotten to press it down. Small things, stupid things, the kind of details that shouldn't matter but somehow did. Then I noticed the keys. I keep spare sets on the shelf in the front hallway. One for my brother, one for emergencies. The space where they'd hung was empty, just 2 small nails and a rectangle of slightly darker paint where dust hadn't settled. I checked every room, under couch cushions, in coat pockets, kitchen drawers, nothing. They were simply gone. That's when the fear really started. Not the sharp, immediate kind that makes you run or fight, but the slow, creeping variety that works its way under your skin and stays there. The kind that makes you check over your shoulder while brushing your teeth. The kind that turns every shadow into a potential threat and every sound into a footstep. I called the building manager. We call him the superintendent here, though he insists on the more formal title. He promised to check the access logs and said he'd have the locks changed by the end of the week. His voice was professionally sympathetic, but ultimately unconcerned. Probably kids, he suggested, or a drunk neighbor who got confused. It happens. But it didn't feel like that. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around me. Every creak was a person. Every whisper of wind through the walls was breath. Around 2 a.m, I gave up and went downstairs. That's when I got the idea with the flour. I took the bag from the pantry, the cheap all-purpose kind I use maybe twice a year, and spread a thin layer across the hallway floor from the kitchen through to the utility closet at the back of the house. A trap. If someone came through during the night, they'd leave tracks. Proof. Something solid I could point to and say, "See, I'm not imagining this." The attic was harder. There's an access panel in the hallway ceiling, and I'd always meant to put a proper lock on it but never got around to it. Now it seemed essential. I couldn't put flour up there, too obvious, so I settled for a strip of clear packing tape across the seam. If it was disturbed, I'd know. I went back to bed but didn't sleep. Instead, I lay there in the dark, fully clothed, listening, waiting. At 3:47 a.m., I heard them. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate. The kind of sound someone makes when they're trying very hard not to make any sound at all. They moved through the downstairs with a confidence that suggested familiarity. No hesitation at doorways. No fumbling in the dark. Just smooth, purposeful movement from room to room. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my throat. I wanted to call out, to confront whoever was down there, but my voice had disappeared. My whole body had locked up, paralyzed by some primal instinct that said, "Don't let them know you're awake. Don't let them know you're here." The footsteps paused at the bottom of the stairs. I could picture someone standing there, head tilted, listening just as I was listening, deciding whether to come up. Then came another sound, a faint metallic scrape, like a lid being carefully replaced. It came from above me, from the attic. The footsteps resumed, moving away toward the back of the house. A moment later, I heard the soft click of the back door closing. I didn't move until the sky started to lighten. Didn't even breathe properly. Just lay there rigid, waiting for dawn like it was a lifeline. When I finally forced myself downstairs, the evidence was undeniable. Footprints, clear as day. They traveled from the kitchen through the flour-dusted hallway to the utility closet and back again. Size 11, maybe 12. Definitely larger than my 9s. The treads were smooth, probably socks or soft-soled shoes. At the closet, the prints paused, shuffled slightly as if the person had been reaching for something, then returned the way they'd come. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the tape on the attic access. It had been cut. Not torn or peeled back, but cut. A clean, straight line through the center as if done with a razor blade or a very sharp knife. Someone had gone up there during the night. While I was lying awake, paralyzed with fear, someone had climbed into my attic, done something, and climbed back down. I didn't go up there to look. I couldn't. The thought of climbing that ladder, pushing up that panel, and sticking my head into that dark space made my stomach turn. What if they were still up there? What if they'd never left? Instead, I called the superintendent again. This time, his tone was different, less dismissive, more concerned. He said he'd come by that afternoon and we'd go through the house together. He also suggested I talk to the neighbors, see if anyone had noticed anything unusual. The neighbor directly across from me is retired, one of those people who seems to spend most of his time watching the street from behind his curtains. When I knocked, he answered immediately, as if he'd been waiting. "We should have a signal," he said after I explained, "in case something happens again. If I see anything suspicious, I'll flash my bedroom light twice. You do the same if you need help." His matter-of-factness was almost comforting, like we were discussing mail delivery rather than potential home invasion. I spent the rest of the day cleaning up the flour, replacing the tape, and trying to convince myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was kids. Maybe I'd imagined the footsteps. Maybe the tape had been loose to begin with. But I knew I hadn't imagined those footprints. Night fell again, and with it came the fear. I sat in my living room with all the lights on, curtains drawn, doors double-checked. Every few minutes I'd glance across the street at the neighbor's house. His lights were on too. I wondered if he was watching, waiting just like I was. At 11:34 p.m., his bedroom light flashed twice. My blood went cold. I killed the living room lamp and moved to the window, pressing myself against the wall so I could peer out without being seen. The street was empty. Nothing moved. But my neighbor's light had definitely flashed twice. He'd seen something. I waited 5 minutes, 10. The house around me was absolutely silent. Not the normal silence of an empty home, but something deeper, more oppressive. The kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes you realize how many small sounds you usually take for granted. The hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the heating system, the subtle creaks of settling wood. All of it was gone. The house was holding its breath. And then, so softly I almost missed it, I heard the click of the back door closing. They were inside. I should have called the police. That's what any reasonable person would have done. But I didn't. Couldn't. Because some part of me, some deep reptilian part, understood that this wasn't something the police could help with. This was something else. Something wrong in a fundamental way that had nothing to do with breaking and entering or trespassing. I stayed frozen at the window, watching the neighbor's house, waiting for another signal that never came. Hours passed. The night stretched impossibly long, each minute feeling like 10. I didn't hear any more footsteps. No sounds of movement. Nothing. Just that heavy, suffocating silence. When dawn finally broke, I searched the house. Every room, every closet, every corner. Nothing was disturbed. Nothing was missing. The tape on the attic access was intact. The back door was locked, deadbolt engaged, chain in place. But when I checked the utility closet, the one where the footprints had led the night before, I found something that hadn't been there yesterday. My spare keys, both sets, hanging neatly on their hooks, exactly where they were supposed to be. That's when the questions really started. Not about who was getting in, but about what was real. Had the keys always been there? Had I simply missed them before? Had there ever really been footprints in the flour? Or had I been so tired, so paranoid, that I'd seen what I expected to see? I thought about the footsteps I'd heard, the confidence with which they'd moved through my house, the familiarity, and I realized something that made my skin crawl. They'd known where everything was. They'd moved through the darkness without hesitation, without bumping into furniture or knocking anything over. Like someone who lived here. Like someone who knew this house as well as I did. Maybe better. I started keeping a journal after that, documenting everything. Times, sounds, strange occurrences, the watermarks in the washing machine that appeared and disappeared, the way my toothbrush sometimes faced a different direction in the morning, the faint smell of something unfamiliar, not cologne or perfume, but something else, something organic and slightly sour, that would occasionally drift through the upstairs hallway. Small things, impossible things, things that made perfect sense in the moment but seemed absurd when I tried to explain them later. The superintendent changed the locks. I installed cameras, but they never caught anything. Just hours of empty rooms and static darkness. The neighbor stopped signaling, and when I asked him about it, he looked at me strangely and said he hadn't seen anything unusual in weeks. Had I been feeling all right? Was the stress getting to me? I started wondering about that. About stress. About the Chicago trip I couldn't quite remember. About the way my memories of that week felt fuzzy and incomplete, like scenes from a movie I'd half-watched while falling asleep. I started wondering if I'd ever really left at all, because here's the thing I can't stop thinking about. Those footprints in the flour. They traveled from the kitchen to the utility closet and back. Not to the back door, not out of the house. They just stopped, ended. As if whoever made them had simply vanished mid-step or had never really been there to begin with. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed listening to the house breathe around me, I think about those footsteps I heard, the way they moved with such certainty through the darkness, the way they knew exactly where to go, exactly how to navigate every corner and doorway without hesitation, the way they sounded exactly like my own. I haven't left the house in 3 weeks now. I'm not sure I remember how. The door is locked from the inside. I check it constantly, but sometimes I find it ajar in the morning, resting against the frame as if someone has just stepped out for a moment and will be right back. The neighbor's light flashed again last night, twice. I saw it through the window. But when I looked at his house, really looked, I realized something I should have noticed before. His bedroom light isn't visible from my living room. The angle is wrong. The walls are in the way. I shouldn't be able to see his window from here. But I do. I see it every night. I see it right now, in fact, flashing twice in the darkness. A signal, a warning, or maybe a message I'm not supposed to understand. The house is quiet again, perfectly quiet. And somewhere, in the space between breaths, I hear the soft whisper of footsteps moving through the dark. They're familiar now, almost comforting. Sometimes I'm not sure if they're coming toward me or if I'm the one who's moving, drifting through my own home like something that doesn't quite belong here anymore, like something that never really did. The tape on the attic access is cut again. I should go up there and look. I know I should. But I also know, with absolute certainty, that if I climb that ladder and push open that panel, I'm going to find something I'm not ready to see. Or maybe I won't find anything at all. I'm not sure which possibility frightens me more. The flower is spread across the hallway again. I did it this morning, though I don't remember doing it. Just like I don't remember locking the back door, even though I know I must have. The keys are on their hooks, the cameras are recording. Everything is exactly where it should be. But the house feels full tonight, occupied, and I can't shake the feeling that I'm not alone, that I haven't been alone for a very long time. Maybe since before Chicago. Maybe since before I first noticed the door was ajar. Maybe I'm the one who's been here all along, and that other me, the one who goes to work and takes trips and lives a normal life, is the intruder, the one who doesn't belong, the one who needs to leave. I'll know for sure in the morning when I check the flower. I'll see the footprints leading from the kitchen to the closet, and I'll measure them against my own feet. And maybe this time the size will match. Maybe this time I'll understand. Or maybe the flower will be perfectly smooth, undisturbed. And I'll realize that all of this, the sounds, the signs, the signals, has been nothing but the house itself, breathing and shifting and living around me, while I slowly become part of its architecture. Either way, I'll be here. I don't think I know how to leave anymore. The house won't let me. Story 9. The knocking began at 11:47 p.m. 3 deliberate raps that seemed to echo not just through my apartment door, but through the hollow of my chest. I was halfway through a documentary about deep-sea creatures, the kind of mindless content that helps insomnia pass, when the sound cut through the narrator's droning voice about anglerfish and made my spine go rigid. Nobody knocks at my door this late. Nobody knocks at my door at all. I muted the television and listened. The building's old radiator hissed and clanked in the corner. Through the thin walls, I could hear my neighbor's television playing some late-night talk show. The knocking came again, more insistent this time, and with it, a voice. "I know you're in there. I can see the light under your door." The voice was unfamiliar, male, with an edge of something I couldn't quite place. Not anger exactly, but a kind of determined patience that felt worse somehow. I stood and moved toward the door, my bare feet silent on the cold hardwood floor. The peephole showed me a distorted fisheye view of the hallway. A man in his mid-30s, maybe early 40s, wearing a dark jacket despite the late October chill having not yet turned severe. His face was partially shadowed, but I could make out sharp cheekbones and eyes that seemed to stare directly into the peephole, as if he knew exactly where I was standing. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said, his voice carrying that same unsettling calm. "I just need to talk to our father. It's important." Our father. The words hung in the air like smoke, acrid and impossible to ignore. My father lived 3 states away, in the same small town where I'd grown up, in the same house with the sprawling oak tree in the backyard and the cracked bird bath that had been there since before I was born. I hadn't spoken to him in 2 weeks, just a brief phone call about his doctor's appointment and whether he'd remembered to get his prescriptions refilled. This stranger's use of the possessive "our" felt like an intrusion into something deeply private, a violation of a boundary I hadn't even known existed. I pulled out my phone and called my father. The man in the hallway must have heard the muffled sound of the ringtone through the door, because he stopped talking and simply waited, his shadowy form unnaturally still through the peephole's warped lens. My father answered on the 4th ring, his voice thick with sleep and confusion. I explained the situation in hushed, urgent tones. The late-night visitor, the claim of brotherhood, the request to speak with him. There was a long silence on the other end, filled only with the sound of my father's breathing, which had become rapid and shallow. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, trembling. He told me not to open the door, said it 3 times in rapid succession like an incantation against evil spirits. Then he asked me to video call him, right now, immediately, and to point the camera at the peephole. The man in the hallway somehow sensed the shift in the situation. He leaned closer to the door and began speaking again, this time reciting information that made my skin crawl. He named my grandmother who had passed away 7 years ago, mentioned the specific date my parents had divorced, a date I myself often got wrong, and described in perfect detail the layout of my childhood home's backyard. The oak tree's gnarled roots that had cracked the patio stones, the rusted swing set that had been too dangerous to use but that my father had never quite gotten around to removing, the small vegetable garden my mother had abandoned after the separation. I switched to video call and held the phone's camera up to the peephole. Through my screen, I could see my father's face, illuminated by his bedside lamp, looking older than I'd ever seen him. His eyes were wide and wet, his mouth working soundlessly for a moment before any words came out. "It's him," my father whispered, and the way he said it made something in my stomach drop like a stone into dark water. "It's really him, but don't open the door. Please don't open the door." The visitor must have heard my father's voice, tinny and distant through the phone's speaker, because he began talking directly to the camera, to the peephole, to my father through layers of wood and glass and digital transmission. He spoke about wanting to meet, about having questions that deserved answers, about how he'd been searching for years, and now that he'd found us, he just wanted acknowledgement. His voice never rose above conversational volume, never took on a threatening tone, and somehow that made it infinitely worse. My father was crying now, silent tears running down his weathered face, and he kept repeating that this wasn't how it was supposed to happen, that he'd always meant to tell me, that he'd always known this day would come, but not like this, never like this. I told the visitor through the door that I was calling the police, that he needed to leave, that this wasn't the time or place for whatever reunion or confrontation he was seeking. He didn't argue. He simply said that he understood, that he'd waited this long and could wait a bit longer, and that we'd talk again soon. Then I heard his footsteps retreating down the hallway, measured and unhurried, fading away toward the stairwell. The community police arrived 20 minutes later, 2 officers who took my statement with professional courtesy while clearly considering this a low-priority domestic matter. They checked the hallway, the stairwell, the building's entrance, but the visitor was long gone. They said they'd increase patrols in the area and advised me to call immediately if he returned. After they left, I sat on my couch in the dark, the documentary still paused on a frame of something with too many teeth swimming in an abyss. My father called back an hour later, more composed but still shaken, and told me about a woman he'd known before he'd met my mother, about a brief relationship that had ended badly, about a child he'd learned existed only years later through a mutual acquaintance. He'd tried to reach out once, he said, but the mother had made it clear she wanted nothing to do with him, that the child was better off without a father who'd never been there from the start. So he'd sent money occasionally, anonymously through a third party, and told himself that was enough, that it had to be enough. I asked him why he'd never told me. He said he'd been planning to, had written and rewritten the conversation in his mind 1,000 times, but the right moment had never seemed to come, and then years had passed, and the secret had calcified into something solid and immovable, a foundation stone he couldn't remove without bringing everything else down. We talked for another hour, until the sky outside began to lighten with the approach of dawn, and when we finally hung up, I felt hollowed out, scraped clean of something essential. That should have been the end of it. In a rational world, it would have been the end of it. The first photograph arrived 3 days later. I found it slipped under my door when I came home from work, a printed image on standard printer paper. It showed the front of my building, taken from across the street, the angle suggesting it had been shot from inside a parked car. My window on the 3rd floor was clearly visible, and I could see, with a jolt of nauseous recognition, the faint glow of my living room lamp through the curtains. The timestamp in the corner read 11:47 p.m. I checked with my neighbors, asked if they'd seen anyone lingering outside, if anyone had noticed someone slipping papers under doors. They hadn't. The building's security camera, an ancient and frequently malfunctioning piece of equipment, had mysteriously been offline that entire evening. The super told me with a shrug that suggested this was not an unusual occurrence. The second photograph came 4 days after the first. Same angle, same building, same timestamp, 11:47 p.m. This time I examined it more closely with a growing sense of unease that went beyond the obvious invasion of privacy. The building looked subtly different, though I couldn't immediately identify why. It took me nearly an hour of comparing it to the first photo before I realized The positions of the parked cars on the street were different, and a tree visible in the frame had shed more leaves. These weren't multiple prints of the same photo. Someone was taking a new picture every few nights at exactly the same time, from exactly the same position. I filed a police report. The officer who took it was sympathetic but realistic about the chances of catching someone engaged in what was technically just photography from a public street. They couldn't do much unless the person made direct threats or attempted to enter the building illegally. I was advised, once again, to call if the situation escalated. The third photograph arrived 6 days later. The pattern was irregular, unpredictable, which somehow made it worse than if they'd come daily. I couldn't anticipate them, couldn't prepare myself. Each time I came home and saw that telltale white rectangle on my floor, my heart would start hammering against my ribs. I began staying awake until midnight, watching from my window, trying to catch sight of whoever was taking these pictures. The first few nights yielded nothing. The street below remained empty save for the occasional passing car or late-night pedestrian. But I kept watching, kept vigil, my eyes burning with exhaustion and my nerves frayed to threads. On the fourth night of my surveillance, at exactly 11:47 p.m., I saw movement in the shadows across the street. A figure emerged from between two parked cars, so smoothly and silently that it seemed less like movement and more like materialization. In the orange glow of the streetlight, I couldn't make out features, just a dark silhouette that stood perfectly still for what felt like an eternity, facing my building. I couldn't see a camera, couldn't see any equipment, but I knew with absolute certainty that this was him and that he was taking another picture. I grabbed my phone and called 911, my voice shaking as I reported someone stalking me, watching my building. The dispatcher asked if I was in immediate danger, if the person was trying to enter, if they'd made any threatening gestures. I had to admit that no, none of those things, just standing and watching, and I could hear the subtle shift in her tone as my call dropped several notches in priority. By the time I looked back at the window, the figure was gone. The next photograph arrived the following afternoon, and it confirmed my worst suspicions. There was my window, my lamp's glow visible through the curtains, and in the grainy enlargement I made at a print shop, feeling paranoid and desperate and not caring anymore, I could just barely make out a shape behind the glass. Me, standing there watching, a pale oval of face, a dark silhouette against the light. He'd taken a picture of me watching for him. Something shifted in my mind after that. The world took on a quality like old film stock, slightly off in color and timing, reality slipping just a little bit out of sync with itself. I started noticing things I'd never paid attention to before. The way my neighbor's door would open a crack when I walked by, the eye visible in the gap watching me pass, the pattern of scratches on my apartment door that seemed to form letters or symbols if you looked at them in the right light, the way my reflection in the bathroom mirror sometimes appeared to move a fraction of a second after I did, like there was lag in the connection between my body and its image. I knew on some rational level that I wasn't sleeping enough, that stress and fear were making me see patterns where none existed, but that knowledge didn't help. The photographs kept coming, each one a precise duplicate of the last in angle and timestamp, but showing subtle changes in the street, the weather, the season progressing in increments marked by these invasive images. I called my father less and less frequently, and when we did talk, we avoided the subject entirely. He'd ask about my work, I'd ask about his health, and we'd dance around the massive, unspoken thing between us. The half-brother I'd never known about who had appeared at my door like something summoned by the very act of keeping secrets. After the 9th or 10th photograph, I'd lost count, kept them all in a drawer I couldn't bring myself to open anymore. I stopped looking for him at 11:47 p.m. Instead, I started doing something else, something I recognized as irrational even as I did it. I would stand at my window at exactly that time, lights on behind me, making myself visible. A kind of offering, maybe, or a challenge. If he wanted to watch, I would let him watch. If he wanted to document my existence, I would present myself for documentation. The night I started doing this, the photographs stopped coming. For 2 weeks, nothing. I should have felt relief, but instead I felt a gnawing anxiety that was somehow worse than the fear. The watching had become a routine, a known quantity, and its absence left me unmoored. I found myself still going to the window at 11:47 p.m., still standing there in the light, still offering myself up to empty darkness and unblinking lenses that might or might not be there. Then, on the 15th day, I came home to find not a photograph, but an envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with an address written in neat, precise handwriting. The address was in my father's town, just 2 streets over from his house. Below it, a date and time. This coming Saturday, 11:47 p.m. I called my father immediately. He answered on the first ring, as if he'd been waiting for my call, and before I could say anything, he told me he'd received the same envelope. He asked me what I was going to do. I told him I didn't know. He said he was planning to go, that after all these years of hiding and avoiding and pretending, maybe it was time to face whatever consequences his choices had created. He asked if I would come with him. The request hung in the air between us, heavy with decades of unspoken things, with the weight of family and blood and obligations I'd never agreed to. I told him I'd think about it and hung up. Saturday came. I didn't pack a bag, didn't make the 3-state drive to my father's town, didn't go to that address at the appointed time. Instead, I stayed in my apartment, doors locked, lights off, sitting in darkness and listening to every sound the building made around me. At 11:47 p.m., I stood at my window and looked out at the empty street below, at the space between parked cars where a shadow might or might not be standing, watching. My phone rang. My father. I let it go to voicemail. He called again an hour later, and again, and on the 4th call I finally answered. His voice was strange, distant, like he was speaking from very far away or underwater. He said he'd gone to the address, that he'd knocked on the door at exactly 11:47 p.m., and that nobody had answered. The house had been dark, empty, with a for sale sign in the yard that looked like it had been there for months. He'd stood on that porch for 20 minutes, he said, knocking and calling out, feeling increasingly foolish and frightened until a neighbor had come out to ask if he was lost, if she could help him find something. When he'd asked about the house, about who lived there, she'd told him it had been vacant for over a year, that the previous owner had moved away after some kind of personal tragedy, that nobody had been by to look at it in months. My father asked me again if I'd come, if I'd been there, his voice cracking with something that might have been fear or relief or disappointment or all three at once. I told him no, that I'd stayed home, and he went quiet for a long time before saying that maybe that had been the right choice, that maybe some doors were better left closed. We haven't talked about it since. That was 6 weeks ago. The photographs haven't resumed. My phone doesn't ring with calls from unknown numbers. When I look out my window at 11:47 p.m., and I still do, can't seem to stop myself, the street below is always empty. But sometimes, when I'm drifting off to sleep, I hear 3 measured knocks on my door, patient and deliberate and somehow inevitable. And sometimes, in that space between waking and dreaming, I wonder if my father actually went to that house alone, or if when he knocked on that dark, empty door, something knocked back from the other side. Sometimes I wonder if the invitation was ever really for Saturday at all, or if it was simply to mark the moment when we would start waiting for the real visit, the one that will come on a night neither of us can predict, at a time we won't see coming, when all 3 of us, father, son, and the brother who exists in the space between truth and lies, will finally have our conversation. The only thing I know for certain is that I still receive one photograph every few weeks, slipped under my door while I sleep or work or go about my ordinary life. Same angle, same timestamp, 11:47 p.m. But now, when I examine them closely, I can see that my window is always dark. No lamp glow, no silhouette visible in the frame. As if whoever takes these pictures knows somehow that I'm no longer watching. As if they're now watching something else entirely. And tonight, as I write this, my bedside clock reads 11:46 p.m., and I can hear footsteps in the hallway outside, slow and measured and moving toward my door, and I find myself wondering whether this time, when the knocking comes, I'll have the strength to keep pretending I'm not home. Story 10. The warehouse district looked different in the fading afternoon light. I had driven past these buildings 100 times on my way to the gym, never really seeing them. Gray structures bleeding into gray pavement, the kind of industrial monotony that exists purely as backdrop. But now, standing in front of the address the recruiter had sent, I felt the weight of their presence. The buildings seemed taller than they should be, their windows like dead eyes tracking my arrival. My phone buzzed. The message was simple: second floor, take your time. I had been unemployed for 3 months. 3 months of sending out resumes into the void, of watching my savings account dwindle, of feeling my confidence corrode like rust on metal. When the recruiter reached out, bright, enthusiastic, promising, I hadn't asked enough questions. The position was vague. Client relations specialist, for a company whose name I couldn't quite remember now, standing here. The pay was excellent. The interview would be quick, she assured me. Just a formality, really. They were very interested in my background. The facade displayed a patchwork of old company signs, each one layered over the last like archaeological strata. I could make out fragments. Industrial supply, vertex log, something that might have been meridian beneath a patina of weather and neglect. None of them matched the company name in the email. I pulled out my phone to check the message again, but my signal had dropped to a single flickering bar. The entrance wasn't locked. The door swung open with a low groan that echoed in the empty lobby, a sound that seemed to travel farther than it should. Inside, the air was different, cooler, heavier, carrying a faint chemical scent I couldn't identify. Not unpleasant, exactly, but wrong, like stepping into a hospital corridor at night, or a museum after closing. There was no reception desk, no directory, just a wide space with industrial tile flooring and fluorescent lights that hummed at a frequency I could feel in my teeth. To the left, a stairwell. To the right, an elevator with a burnished steel door that reflected my image in a distorted funhouse way. I looked taller in the reflection, thinner, my features stretched and somehow uncertain. The stairs seemed safer than the elevator. I climbed to the second floor, my footsteps creating a rhythm that almost sounded like conversation. Step, echo, as if someone were following me at a precise interval. I stopped twice, listening, but heard nothing except the building's ambient sounds. The groan of settling metal, the whisper of air through unseen ducts, the distant hum of machinery that might have been real, or might have been the blood in my ears. The second floor hallway stretched longer than the building's exterior suggested it should. Doors lined both sides, most of them unmarked, their surfaces dull with age and accumulated grime from 1,000 forgotten touches. Some were slightly ajar, revealing darkness so complete it seemed tangible. The fluorescent lights here were spaced farther apart, creating pools of shadow between islands of sickly illumination. I checked my phone again. The message from the recruiter didn't specify which door. I tried calling her. The number showed as unknown on my screen, though I was certain I had saved her contact information after our initial conversation. The call didn't connect. No ring, no busy signal, just dead air with a faint static underneath that might have been breathing. Then I saw it. A piece of paper taped to one of the doors about halfway down the corridor. As I approached, I could see my name printed in a font that seemed too precise, too perfect, as if it had been laser cut rather than printed. The door itself was metal, heavier than the others, with a small window of reinforced glass at eye level. Through the glass I could see only darkness. In front of the door, someone had marked the floor with strips of duct tape, forming a large X. The tape looked fresh, the adhesive still tacky in places, catching the light with a slight sheen. I stood at the edge of the X, unsure whether I was meant to stand on it or avoid it. The instructions seemed deliberately ambiguous, like a test with no right answer. I knocked. The sound was flat, absorbed by the door's mass without producing the expected resonance. No response. I knocked again, harder, and noticed that my knuckles left no mark on the metal surface, as if the door were somehow repelling the natural oils and warmth of human contact. "Please wait in the corridor," the new text message read. "Someone will be with you shortly." I hadn't heard my phone buzz. I checked the sender. Unknown again. I opened my message history with the recruiter. Her avatar, which I remembered as a professional headshot showing a pleasant woman in her 30s with auburn hair, now displayed a generic silhouette. I scrolled up through our previous conversations. The avatar changed with each message. Different hair, different background, different person. The same phone number, but the image shifted like a flipbook animation, each frame subtly wrong. The hallway's temperature seemed to drop. I could see my breath now, faint clouds dissipating in the stagnant air. My instincts screamed to leave, but the rational part of my brain, the part that had been beaten down by 3 months of rejection, insisted this was all explainable. Old building, strange heating system. Technical glitch with the phone. The recruiter probably used stock photos and kept forgetting to update her profile. Companies did weird things all the time. I moved away from the X, positioning myself against the opposite wall where I could watch both the metal door and the corridor's entrance. From this angle, I noticed something I had missed before. A small security camera mounted in the corner where the ceiling met the wall, its lens pointed directly at the X. A tiny red light pulsed beneath the lens, slow and rhythmic, like a heartbeat. Time moved strangely in that hallway. I checked my phone repeatedly, but the clock seemed to jump and stutter. 5:47, then 5:52, then back to 5:48. I tried to focus on counting my breaths, anchoring myself in the physical act of existing, but kept losing count around 30, my mind wandering to dark places. Had I told anyone where I was going? I tried to remember. I had mentioned the interview to my roommate this morning, hadn't I? Or had I only thought about mentioning it? The memory felt slippery, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. A sound emerged from somewhere deeper in the building, a low, sustained note that could have been mechanical or vocal. It rose and fell with an almost musical quality, creating harmonics that made my bones ache. The sound continued for exactly 14 seconds. I counted, then stopped with an abruptness that left the silence feeling aggressive. I took out a small notebook I always carried and wrote down the time, 5:53, along with the building's address and the word interview. I tore out the page carefully, the small ripping sound inappropriately loud. Moving slowly, hyper-aware of the camera's red eye watching, I approached the camera's position and placed the paper on the floor directly beneath it, anchored by a pen I wouldn't need anymore. The metal door remained closed. No sound emerged from behind it, no light showed through the reinforced glass window. But I could feel something on the other side, a presence, a weight, an attention so focused it had physical substance. The sensation reminded me of being in deep water and knowing, absolutely knowing, that something large moved in the darkness below. I needed to leave. This thought crystallized with perfect clarity, cutting through the fog of rationalization I had been constructing. This wasn't about paranoia or anxiety, or the desperation of unemployment. This was basic animal instinct, the same instinct that had kept my ancestors alive when they encountered predators in the dark. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong with this place. I walked back toward the stairwell, fighting the urge to run. Running would mean panic, and panic meant losing control. I forced myself to maintain a steady pace, even as every nerve in my body screamed for flight. Behind me, the fluorescent lights began to flicker in sequence, creating a wave of shadow that followed my movement down the hallway. The stairwell door should have been 30 feet away. I had counted the steps when I arrived, 43 from the stairwell to the metal door. But now the corridor stretched impossibly, the door remaining at the same distant point no matter how far I walked. The building was playing tricks with perspective, or my mind was fragmenting, or both. I stopped walking, stood still, counted to 10, focusing on the texture of the floor beneath my shoes, the weight of my jacket, the taste of copper fear in my mouth. When I opened my eyes, the stairwell door was right in front of me, close enough to touch. Behind me, the metal door opened. I didn't see it. I was already facing the stairwell, but I heard the distinctive sound of heavy hinges moving, followed by a soft exhalation that might have been air pressure equalizing or might have been breath. Then a voice, barely audible, shaped into words that seemed designed to burrow into my brain. Is that him? Not asking me. asking someone else. Someone who could see me, who had been watching, who would know the answer. I pushed through the stairwell door and took the stairs 3 at a time. The descent seemed faster than the climb, gravity pulling me down through the building's geometry toward ground level and escape. My footsteps created a thunderous rhythm, but underneath, I could hear other sounds. Doors opening, footsteps on metal grating, the whisper of fabric against walls. The lobby appeared unchanged, exactly as I had left it, but the shadows were deeper now. The sky outside had darkened toward dusk, that uncertain hour when the world transforms, and nothing can be trusted to remain as it seems. Through the windows, I could see my car in the lot, a solid point of normalcy in this increasingly unstable situation. I was halfway across the lobby when my phone began to ring. The sound was wrong, too loud, too sharp, cutting through the space like a scream. I grabbed the phone from my pocket. Unknown caller. I watched it ring 3 times before silencing it. Immediately, a text message appeared. "You're leaving? The interview hasn't started yet. Don't you want the opportunity?" The last word carried weight, like it was capitalized in meaning beyond typography. The opportunity. Not an opportunity, but the opportunity. As if this specific chance was unique, irreplaceable, the answer to questions I hadn't known to ask. I put the phone in my pocket without responding and pushed through the front door. The outside air hit me like a physical force, cold and clean, tasting of exhaust and distant rain and the normal, beautiful pollution of city life. I walked to my car without looking back, got in, locked the doors, started the engine. The dashboard clock read 6:47, though I couldn't have been inside for more than 20 minutes. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The building stood exactly as it had when I arrived, gray and unremarkable, already fading back into the urban landscape's white noise. But in one of the second-floor windows, I saw movement. A figure standing in the reinforced glass window of the metal door, watching my departure. I drove for 15 minutes before pulling over at a gas station, my hands shaking too badly to continue safely. I needed coffee, light, people. The gas station was brilliant with fluorescent glare, every corner illuminated, the clerk scrolling through his phone behind bulletproof glass. Normal. Real. I bought coffee and stood in the parking lot, letting the caffeine and normalcy seep into my bones. When I finally checked my phone, I found that the recruiter's number had disappeared from my contacts. The message thread was gone. There was no evidence of any job listing, no emails, no conversation history. I searched my sent folder, my trash, my archived messages. Nothing. But in my notebook, the page I had torn out and left beneath the camera was missing. The page before it and the page after it were pristine, but the spot where I had written the time and address showed only the faint impression of my pen, the ghost of information I knew I had recorded. I called my roommate. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice thick with sleep. "Did I mention an interview this morning?" I asked. "Did I tell you I was going somewhere?" A pause. "You left early, yeah? Said you had something important." Didn't say what. "Did I seem normal?" "Define normal," he said, and I could hear him sitting up, concern entering his voice. "You okay? You sound weird." "I'm fine," I told him, though we both knew it was a lie. "I'll be home soon." I hung up and stood in the gas station parking lot, watching cars pass on the street, each one carrying people to normal places for normal reasons. The world continued its ordinary rotation, indifferent to the pocket of wrongness I had stumbled into. 2 days later, scrolling through job listings in the cold light of my laptop screen, I found a posting that made my blood freeze. Same vague position description, same excellent pay, same company name I couldn't quite focus on. But different address, a warehouse in a different industrial district. The photograph showing a building with the same architectural DNA as the one I had fled. The recruiter's message appeared immediately. "We'd love to give you another chance. Sometimes people need time to think about the opportunity. What do you say?" I closed the laptop, unplugged it, put it in a drawer. But the message had already wormed into my mind, asking questions I didn't want to answer. Had I actually left? Was I still standing in that hallway, frozen in place while my mind constructed an elaborate fantasy of escape? Could I trust any of what I remembered, or had something fundamental in my perception fractured during those minutes, hours, inside that building? The worst part isn't the fear. Fear is clean, honest, evolutionary. The worst part is the uncertainty, the creeping suspicion that reality has become negotiable, that the boundaries between what happened and what might have happened have dissolved like sugar in water. Sometimes, late at night, I think I can still hear that sustained note rising from somewhere deep beneath the city, mechanical or vocal, real or remembered, invitation or warning. And sometimes, checking my rearview mirror while driving past industrial districts at dusk, I see the same gray building in different locations, its windows dark except for one, where a figure stands watching, patient and inevitable. The phone never rings anymore, but I still feel it vibrating in my pocket, messages arriving from unknown, asking the same question in an infinity of variations. Don't you want the opportunity? I never answer, but I haven't thrown the phone away either. And that perhaps is the most terrifying thing of all. The part of me that still wonders, that still calculates odds and weighs desperation against instinct, that looks at my dwindling bank account and thinks, almost thinks, that maybe next time I should stay. Maybe next time I should step onto the X and wait for the door to open and finally see what opportunity looks like when it stops pretending to be human. After all, they know where I am. They've always known. The only question that remains is whether they're waiting for me to come back, or whether I never left at all. Story 11. The fluorescent lights above the reception desk hummed their familiar electric hymn, casting that peculiar shade of white that makes everything look slightly deceased. I'd been doing night maintenance at the studio for 8 months, and I'd learned the language of the building, the settling groans of wood, the whisper of ventilation through ducts, the distant complaint of pipes. Every structure has its own vocabulary of sounds, and this one usually spoke in predictable sentences. Until the night I heard the Swiss ball bounce. It was 2:47 a.m. when the sound cut through the silence. A distinctive rubber thud against hardwood, then another, then a third. The main studio was supposed to be empty. I'd already done my walkthrough, checked the locks, confirmed the alarm system was armed except for the motion sensors on my floor. The building and I were supposed to be alone. I stood at the supply closet, mop in hand, feeling my pulse climb into my throat. The studio was at the end of the hallway, through 2 sets of doors. I'd cleaned it an hour ago. Everything had been in its place. The bolsters lined up along the wall, the blocks stacked in their designated bins, the Swiss balls in their rack. Nothing moved on its own there. Nothing should have moved. The rational part of my brain offered explanations: settling air pressure, something falling, auditory pareidolia, the mind's tendency to find patterns in random noise. But I'd been listening to this building's sounds for months, and I knew what I'd heard. 3 distinct bounces, each one diminishing in height like a ball someone had dropped and let settle naturally. I walked down the hallway, my sneakers silent on the polished floor. The first set of doors were propped open. I always left them that way during my shift for ventilation. Through the glass panels of the second set, I could see the main studio bathed in emergency lighting. Everything tinted that sickly amber green that exit signs emit. The space looked exactly as I'd left it, except for the purple Swiss ball resting in the center of the floor. My chest tightened. I'd returned that ball to the rack myself. I specifically remembered because it had a small scuff mark near the air valve, and I'd positioned it scuff side in so it wouldn't be visible to the morning classes. Now it sat there, perfectly centered in the room, as if someone had placed it with deliberate care. I pushed through the doors and approached the ball slowly, my footsteps echoing in the open space. The studio was designed with acoustic paneling to dampen sound during classes, but at night, with no bodies to absorb the noise, every sound felt amplified and strange. I could hear my own breathing, feel the slight movement of air from the HVAC system against my face. When I reached the ball, I noticed it had stopped in a specific spot. directly over a place where the vinyl flooring had lifted slightly from the subfloor. It was a minor defect we'd been meaning to fix, barely noticeable, just a small area where something heavy had been repeatedly placed. The maintenance supervisor had mentioned it before. Someone always sets their mat right there, despite having the entire floor to choose from. Creatures of habit, he'd said. We all have our spots. I picked up the ball and returned it to the rack, making sure it was secure this time. Then I stood there for a moment, scanning the room. The mirrors along the wall reflected the emergency lighting in strange angles. The shadows seemed deeper than usual, pooling in the corners where the ambient light didn't quite reach. My reflection looked back at me from multiple angles, fragmented across the mirrored wall, gray hoodie, tired eyes, a posture that suggested I was trying to convince myself everything was fine. I left the studio and returned to my cleaning rounds, but the unease followed me like a cold draft. I found myself checking over my shoulder, pausing mid-task to listen for sounds that shouldn't be there. The building had stopped speaking its familiar language and had fallen into an uncomfortable silence, as if it too was listening. At 3:15 a.m., I checked the security footage. The studio had 2 cameras, one covering the entrance and reception, another positioned high in the corner of the main studio. I pulled up the feed from the studio camera and scrolled back to 2:45 a.m. The timestamp in the corner ticked backwards through empty minutes of static stillness. Then, at 2:46:47, something appeared. Not walked in. Appeared. The Swiss ball was suddenly in the center of the floor, and standing beside it was a figure. My hands went cold. The image was grainy in the emergency lighting, pixelated at the edges where the camera struggled with low light, but clear enough to see. The figure was slightly bent, as if caught mid-motion, reaching toward the ball. They wore what looked like a blue shirt, not the gray hoodie I had on. The posture was wrong too. The angle of the shoulders, the tilt of the head. This wasn't me. I watched as the figure straightened up and took a step back. The movement was fluid but somehow wrong, like watching someone move underwater or in footage played at slightly the wrong speed. Then the figure bent down again, placing their hands on the ball, and the camera glitched. A brief stutter in the feed, and when it cleared, the figure was gone. Only the ball remained. I played it again, then again. Each time, the same sequence: appearance, movement, glitch, disappearance. The timestamp confirmed I'd been in the supply closet at that exact moment, 40 feet away, separated by 2 sets of doors and a hallway. The building's keycard log showed only my entry at 11 p.m. The motion sensors in the reception area hadn't triggered. No one else had a key except the owner and the supervisor, and both lived across town. I sat back in the office chair, feeling the room contract around me. There were explanations. There had to be. A fault in the camera, somehow playing back old footage. A digital artifact, some corruption in the video file. Maybe someone had been in during the day, and the footage had gotten misaligned with the timestamp. Maybe I was looking at yesterday's recording, or last week's. But I knew the ball's position. I knew that specific scuff mark, and I'd watched it appear in real time on the feed, exactly when I'd heard the bouncing. I needed to think. I needed air. I stepped outside through the rear service entrance, letting the November cold cut through my hoodie. The parking lot was empty except for my car, a lonely pool of sodium light in the surrounding darkness. Beyond the lot, a thin strip of wood separated the studio from a residential area. Nothing moved. No wind, no animals, just the distant hum of traffic from the highway. When I came back inside, I decided to continue my routine. Normalcy felt like a lifeline. I mopped the locker rooms, cleaned the bathrooms, wiped down the reception counter. I told myself I'd finish the shift, go home, and mention the camera glitch to the supervisor tomorrow. These things happened. Technology failed. Cameras malfunctioned. But when I returned to the main studio at 4:20 a.m. to do a final check, I found myself doing something I couldn't quite explain. I took a piece of Taylor's chalk from the supply closet. We used it occasionally to mark spots on the floor for equipment placement, and drew a circle around the area where the vinyl flooring had lifted. A perfect circle, about 3 feet in diameter, encompassing that slightly raised spot where the ball had stopped. I didn't know why I did it. Some instinct, some need to mark and measure, to turn the invisible into something I could quantify. If something happened again, I'd know. I'd have proof of movement, of interaction, of something real occurring in physical space. I finished my shift and drove home as dawn broke over the strip malls and chain restaurants. The sunrise looked wrong, too orange, like the world had been color-corrected slightly off. I slept poorly, dreaming of empty rooms and figures that appeared and disappeared in the spaces between blinks. The next night, I arrived at 11 p.m. with a knot in my stomach that hadn't loosened since I'd woken up. The studio looked exactly as it should. Reception desk clean, lobby serene, the faint scent of lavender and eucalyptus from the oil diffusers. I checked the main studio first before starting any work. The chalk circle was still there, pristine and undisturbed. The Swiss ball remained in its rack. I began my routine, moving through the familiar tasks with mechanical precision. Trash collection, surface sanitizing, restroom cleaning. I kept the doors to the main studio closed this time, and I set up my phone on the reception desk to record the hallway. If the camera glitched again, I wanted a second source. At 2:30 a.m., I was restocking paper towels in the men's locker room when I heard it. Not a bounce this time, but a different sound. A soft friction, like fabric sliding against vinyl. It came from the main studio. I walked to the hallway and looked at my phone. The screen showed an empty corridor, both sets of doors closed, nothing moving. But the sound continued, rhythmic and quiet, like someone shifting their weight, settling into a position. I approached the studio doors slowly. Through the glass I could see the space looked empty. The emergency lighting cast its usual sickly glow. Everything appeared normal. But that sound persisted, just barely audible through the doors, a whisper of movement that made my scalp prickle. I pushed through and entered the studio. The Swiss ball was in the rack. The bolsters lined the wall. The blocks remained stacked, but the chalk circle was wrong. The edge was smudged, not completely erased, not disturbed by a foot or a ball, but smudged along one section as if something heavy and blunt had pressed against it and dragged slightly. The pattern was consistent with a knee, someone kneeling at the edge of the circle, their weight compressing the chalk line, the friction of movement blurring the sharp edge I'd drawn. I crouched down and examined the mark. The smudge was fresh. I could see chalk dust on the vinyl around it. My hands were shaking now, a fine tremor I couldn't control. Someone had been here. Something had been here. In the time between when I'd checked the studio at 11 p.m. and now, something had interacted with this space. I pulled up the security footage on my phone, accessing the system remotely. I scrolled to 2:15 a.m. and watched. The studio remained empty in the frame, the chalk circle visible at the edge of the camera's view. I fast-forwarded through the minutes. 2:20 a.m., nothing. 2:25 a.m., still empty. Then at 2:28 a.m., the image flickered. It wasn't a glitch this time. It was worse. The camera showed the studio exactly as it was, but for 3 seconds, I counted them, rewatched them, confirmed them. A shadow appeared within the chalk circle. Not a figure, not a person, just a darker area, a concentration of absence where light should have been reaching the floor. It stayed for 3 seconds, then faded like ink diffusing in water. I stood up too quickly, feeling dizzy. The studio felt smaller suddenly, the mirrors reflecting not just space but something else, some quality of wrongness I couldn't articulate. The air seemed thicker, harder to breathe. I wanted to leave, to walk out and never come back, but something kept me rooted there. Not curiosity exactly, but a deeper compulsion. The same instinct that makes you probe a sore tooth with your tongue, even though you know it will hurt. I spent the next 2 hours finishing my shift in a state of hypervigilance, every sense amplified and raw. I heard things I'd never noticed before. The almost subsonic hum of the building's electrical system, the minute creaks of the structure cooling, the sound of my own pulse in my ears. I checked the studio every 20 minutes, finding it unchanged each time except for a growing sensation that I was being watched, that the empty space was not as empty as it appeared. At 6 a.m., when the morning instructor arrived, I was sitting in the office, reviewing footage I'd captured on my phone. She greeted me with her usual cheerful energy, commenting on how clean everything looked. I nodded, responded with practiced normalcy, and left without mentioning anything. What would I say? That shadows moved in empty rooms, that chalk marks were disturbed by invisible pressure, that something was occupying space without occupying it? I went home, but I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of exhaustion press down on me like a physical force. My mind kept returning to that figure on the security footage, the blue shirt, the bent posture, the way it had appeared and disappeared, and the shadow, that concentration of darkness within the chalk circle, present for exactly 3 seconds. The third night, I brought a digital recorder. I placed it in the corner of the studio, hidden behind a bolster, set to voice-activated recording. I also brought a laser level, a tool I used occasionally for installation work, and set it up to project a grid pattern across the floor of the studio, including over the chalk circle. If anything disrupted the laser lines, if anything passed through that space, the distortion would be visible. I started my shift with a ritualistic thoroughness, moving through each task with meticulous attention, creating a rhythm that felt like protection. But underneath the routine, anxiety hummed like a live wire. I kept checking the studio, watching the laser grid paint its red lines across the empty floor, everything geometric and ordered and seemingly secure. At 1:45 a.m., my phone vibrated. The security system had triggered an alert, not a breach, but an environmental anomaly. Temperature drop in the main studio, 12 degrees in 2 minutes. I rushed to the hallway and saw my breath condense in the air. The temperature had plummeted. Through the glass doors, I could see the laser grid, still projecting its pattern, but the air in the studio had changed quality, becoming thick and visible, like the space was filling with something I couldn't name. I pushed through the doors and immediately felt the cold envelop me. Not just physical temperature, but something deeper, something that reached past skin and muscle to something more fundamental. The laser lines wavered slightly, disturbed by what might have been air currents or might have been something else moving through them. Then I saw it in the grid, a disruption, a section where the laser lines bent and refracted as if passing through a different medium. The distortion was located directly over the chalk circle. It wasn't moving, just existing there, a presence defined by its effect on light. I grabbed my phone and started recording, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the device steady. The distortion remained for maybe 20 seconds, the laser lines bending around it like light around a gravitational field. Then, slowly, the effect diminished, the lines straightening, the temperature beginning to rise. I stood there long after it disappeared, feeling my heart hammering against my ribs. The digital recorder sat in the corner, its red light blinking, capturing God knows what. I didn't retrieve it immediately. I wasn't sure I wanted to know what sounds it had recorded. When I finally worked up the courage to collect the device, it was 3:30 a.m. I played back the recording, listening through earbuds as I sat in the office. For the first 40 minutes, there was nothing but ambient sound. The HVAC, distant traffic, my own footsteps during my rounds. Then, at 1:44 a.m., just before the temperature alert, the recorder captured something. It wasn't a voice. Not exactly. It was more like the suggestion of breathing, rhythmic and slow, the kind of breath someone takes when they're settling into a position, preparing to hold it for a long time. And underneath that, so faint I had to replay it 3 times to be sure, was another sound. Fabric against vinyl, the same friction I'd heard the night before. The breathing continued for 18 seconds, then stopped. I sat in the office chair, feeling reality become negotiable. The rational explanations I'd been constructing, camera glitches, temperature fluctuations, chalk marks disturbed by air pressure, all crumbled under the accumulated weight of events. Something was in the studio, something was using that space, returning to it, occupying it in ways I couldn't fully perceive or understand. The question that terrified me most wasn't what it was. It was simpler and more immediate. What did it want? And why did it only appear when I was there? I finished the rest of my shift in a daze, moving through the motions mechanically. I avoided the main studio, leaving it unchecked for the first time since I'd started working there. When I left at 6 a.m., I glanced back through the glass doors and saw the chalk circle still there, the laser level still projecting its grid. Everything looked normal in the growing daylight, but I knew that normality was a thin skin stretched over something I didn't want to touch. That day, I researched the building's history. The studio had been operating for 5 years, but the building itself was older, a converted office space from the 1970s. Before that, the land had been residential. I found old property records, zoning maps, nothing remarkable. No deaths, no tragedies, nothing that would explain what I was experiencing. I called in sick for the next 2 nights. I told the supervisor I had the flu, which wasn't entirely untrue. I felt physically ill, feverish with anxiety, my sleep fractured and thin. But on the 3rd night, guilt or compulsion or something darker drew me back. The studio still needed maintenance. The routine still needed to be maintained. And part of me needed to know if it would happen again, needed to confirm I wasn't losing my mind. I arrived at 11 p.m. with a plan. I would set up multiple cameras on my phone and tablet, position them at different angles. I would mark the floor with more chalk, creating a grid that would show any movement. I would monitor everything, document everything, create evidence that couldn't be explained away. But when I entered the main studio to set up, I found the chalk circle had been erased, not smudged, not disturbed, completely erased. The vinyl floor clean where the mark had been, as if I'd never drawn it at all. The laser level was gone too, though I'd left it secured in the corner. I found it in the supply closet, carefully placed on a shelf, its case zipped shut. Someone had cleaned up my experiment. Someone had removed the evidence. But the security logs showed only my keycard access. No one else had entered. I stood in the center of the studio, in the spot where the circle had been, and felt the floor slightly give beneath my feet. That subtle lift in the vinyl. That persistent imperfection we'd never fixed. And for the first time, I wondered if the defect had always been there, or if it had been created, worn down by something returning again and again, pressing down in the same place, leaving its mark on the physical world through sheer repetition. My phone buzzed. A text from the supervisor. "How are you feeling? Owner wants to know if you can cover tomorrow night too. Regular guy is out." I stared at the message, my mind struggling to parse it. Regular guy? I was the regular guy. I'd been doing night maintenance for 8 months. There was no one else. I called him immediately. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice thick with sleep. I asked him what he meant. He seemed confused by my confusion. The owner had hired someone else for nights 3 months ago, he told me. I'd been moved to a different property, the gym across town. He'd sent me the schedule change via email. Had I not received it? I felt the floor tilt beneath me. No email, no schedule change. I'd been coming here every night for 8 months, unlocking the door with my key card, doing the work, leaving at dawn. But according to the system, according to the records, I'd stopped being scheduled here months ago. I hung up and checked my keycard access log on my phone. The entries showed regular activity, my card, my ID number, scanning in at 11 p.m., scanning out at 6 a.m., 3 nights a week just like always. But now, looking at the timestamps, I noticed something I'd never paid attention to before. The scan times were exact. 11 p.m., not 11:01 or 10:58, but exactly on the hour, every time. And the exit scans, 6 a.m., precisely. Real keycard scans are never that exact. There's always variation, seconds of difference. These entries were too perfect, too consistent, as if they'd been generated rather than recorded. I walked to the front desk and tried to access the owner's contact information on the computer. The system asked for a password I didn't have. I tried the supervisor's extension. The line rang forever, even though I'd just spoken to him. I tried the emergency contact list posted on the wall. Every number went to the same voicemail, a generic message, No names, no specifics. The building was silent around me. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric hymn. The mirrors reflected my gray hoodie, my tired eyes, my posture that suggested I was trying very hard not to panic. I walked back to the main studio and stood at the entrance, looking in through the glass. The space was empty, the emergency lighting casting its amber-green glow. Everything was in its place. The mats, the blocks, the bolsters, the Swiss balls in their rack, including the purple one with the scuff mark. And on the floor, in the exact center of the room, where the vinyl had that slight lift, there was an indentation. Fresh, as if someone had just been kneeling there, their weight pressing down, holding a position. I approached slowly, feeling my breath come shallow and quick. The indentation was clear. 2 knee marks, a handprint beside them, the pattern of someone in a resting pose, the kind you hold at the end of a practice, when you're transitioning from movement to stillness, from effort to release. I knelt down beside the marks, matching my knees to the indentations, placing my hand where the handprint was. The vinyl was warm beneath my palm, recently pressed, recently occupied. I stayed there, frozen in that posture, feeling the building breathe around me. And then I understood. The question wasn't who was appearing in the empty studio. The question was who was doing the watching, who was reviewing the footage, analyzing the marks, setting up experiments to document the presence, who had been showing up every night for months, convinced they were maintaining an empty building when the schedules and the logs and the emails said otherwise. I looked up at the camera in the corner, its red light blinking steadily, recording everything. I wondered what it saw. I wondered what I looked like from that angle. A figure in gray, kneeling in the center of an empty room, present and absent at the same time, trapped in a routine that had become indistinguishable from haunting. The mirrors reflected me back in fragments. I could see myself from multiple angles, could see the posture I held, the way I seemed both there and not there, both solid and somehow translucent in the emergency lighting. I couldn't tell anymore which reflection was real, which one was me as I existed, and which one was the ghost of someone who used to do night maintenance in a building that had moved on without them. I stood up slowly, feeling the vinyl settle back into place beneath me. The building had returned to its familiar sounds, the groan of wood, the whisper of ventilation, the distant complaint of pipes, speaking its usual language, comfortable and known. I walked out of the studio, through the hallway, past the reception desk. My keycard scanned with a beep. 6 a.m. Exactly, as it always did, as it always would. Outside, dawn was breaking over the parking lot, painting everything in shades of orange that looked slightly wrong, like the world had been color-corrected off by just a degree. My car sat in its usual spot, alone under the sodium lights. I got in, started the engine, and drove home through streets that felt familiar but somehow rearranged, like someone had moved all the buildings slightly to the left, while I wasn't paying attention. I told myself I'd call the supervisor tomorrow, get this straightened out, find out what had happened, why the schedules had changed, why no one had told me. But deep down, beneath the rational thoughts and the planned conversations, I knew I wouldn't. Because some questions have answers that are worse than the not knowing, and some routines, once established, are impossible to break, even when you can't remember starting them, even when you can't be sure they're really happening, even when everyone else has moved on and left you alone with the work that never ends. I'll go back tonight. I always do. Someone has to maintain the building. Someone has to check the empty rooms, mark the movements, document the presence of absence. Someone has to kneel in the center of the studio, pressing down on the vinyl that never quite lies flat, leaving marks that someone else will find and wonder about. Someone has to be there, and whoever's watching from the other side of the camera has to keep recording, keep trying to understand why the space they thought was empty keeps showing signs of occupation. One of us is the ghost. I just can't tell anymore which one it is. All I know is this. When you work nights long enough, the boundary between haunting and being haunted becomes as thin as the difference between 11 p.m. and 11:01. And by the time you notice the precision, by the time you see how perfectly regular your routine has become, It's already too late to tell whether you're the one keeping watch or the one being watched. The building will be waiting tonight, as it always is. The Swiss ball will bounce exactly 3 times. The figure in blue will appear in the camera feed. The chalk will be disturbed. And I'll document it all, gathering evidence of my own disappearance. One perfectly timed keycard scan at a time. Story 12. The notification buzzed twice in rapid succession while I was 3 miles from home, stuck at a red light that seemed to last forever. Someone at the door. The video feed loaded in stuttering frames. A figure in dark clothing, face angled away from the camera, hand reaching toward the doorbell. Then nothing. The figure stepped backward, dissolving into the darkness beyond the porch light's reach, moving with the kind of deliberate care that made my throat tighten. I activated the siren remotely, that piercing wail I'd installed last year after the Hendersons got cleaned out while they were at their daughter's wedding. My fingers fumbled with the phone, nearly dropping it as I dialed 911, explaining in fragments that someone was at my house, that I was on my way, that the feed showed something wrong. The dispatcher's voice was professionally calm, almost bored, asking for my address while I gunned the engine through the intersection. The drive home became a blur of streetlights and shallow breathing. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white, and I kept glancing at the phone mounted on the dashboard, watching the live feed from the hallway camera. That's when I saw it. A thin beam of light, yellowish and narrow, sweeping slowly across the corridor walls. A flashlight. Someone was inside. But the beam never crossed the camera's direct line of sight. It played along the edges, illuminating the baseboards, the corner where the antique mirror hung, the doorframe to the guest room. Whoever held it knew exactly where the cameras were mounted, knew their angles and blind spots with unsettling precision. The light moved with patience, with the kind of methodical certainty that suggested study, practice, rehearsal. I pulled into the driveway so fast the car lurched when I hit the brakes. The house stood there under the weak glow of the street lamp, looking exactly as it always did. White siding, dark shutters, the maple tree's shadow stretching across the lawn like grasping fingers. But something felt different now, something I couldn't name. The air itself seemed heavier, colder than it should have been for October. The police arrived 7 minutes later. 2 officers, one older with gray threading his temples, the other younger and built like he spent his off hours at the gym. They moved through the house with practiced efficiency, flashlights cutting through the darkness. I suddenly realized I'd been standing in without turning on any lights. My hand had been frozen on the doorknob, my breath coming in short gasps that fogged in the unseasonably cold air. The master bedroom window. That's where they found it. The glass wasn't broken, nothing so obvious, so clean. The lock mechanism had been manipulated from the inside, they said. The magnetic sensor carefully defeated with something thin and precise, probably a wire or a specialized tool. Someone who knew what they were doing. Someone who'd done this before, or who'd spent time learning the system, understanding its weaknesses. The jewelry boxes were gone from the dresser top. 3 small ones, antiques that had belonged to my grandmother, ornate things with mother-of-pearl inlay and tiny brass hinges. Inside them had been trinkets, costume jewelry mostly, things with sentimental value but little monetary worth. The drawers remained untouched, including the one where I kept my actual valuables, the watches and cufflinks and the emergency cash I'd stupidly mentioned to a coworker last month during a lunch break discussion about home security. The older officer stood by the window, running his flashlight along the frame, and mentioned something about a dark SUV spotted in the neighborhood over the past week. Multiple residents had called it in. It parked at different spots along the street, idling for 20 or 30 minutes before moving on. No one had gotten a plate number. No one had thought much of it until now. They left around midnight, taking photos, dusting for prints they said they probably wouldn't find. They gave me a case number and said they'd increase patrols in the area. The younger officer paused at the door and suggested I might want to stay with friends for a few days, just until things settled down. But the way he said it, with that slight inflection that wasn't quite concern and wasn't quite dismissal, made it clear he didn't expect they'd catch anyone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room armchair, the one positioned where I could see both the front door and the hallway leading to the bedrooms, and I listened. The house made sounds I'd never noticed before. The settling of joists, the whisper of air through vents, the almost imperceptible creak of floorboards expanding and contracting with temperature changes. Each sound became potentially significant, potentially threatening. The refrigerator's compressor kicking on made me jump. A branch scraping the kitchen window sent my heart racing. Around 3 in the morning, exhaustion started winning over adrenaline. My eyelids grew heavy, my thoughts sluggish and disconnected. I'd almost drifted off when I heard it, a soft sound from somewhere in the back of the house, like fabric brushing against a wall. I froze, every muscle tensing, listening so intently my ears started creating phantom noises in the silence. Nothing followed. Just that one sound, brief and ambiguous, that could have been anything or nothing. The next evening, I left lights on. Not everywhere. That would look suspicious, unnatural. Just the living room and the hallway, the way they might be if someone was home and moving between rooms. I set a radio by the front door, tuned to a talk station, volume low enough to sound like someone in another room having a conversation. These were the kinds of tricks the police had suggested, the theatrical performances we staged to convince potential intruders that we're home, that we're vigilant, that we're not easy targets. At 2 in the morning, the motion sensor chimed. I'd been half asleep on the couch, and the sound jolted through me like electricity. I grabbed my phone, pulled up the camera feed with shaking fingers. The porch was empty. The hallway was empty. Every camera showed nothing but still, silent rooms and the gentle sway of shadows as tree branches moved outside the windows. I checked the sensor log. Motion detected at the front door at 2:03 a.m. Duration, approximately 4 seconds. No visual on any camera feed. I scrolled back through the recorded footage, frame by frame, but there was nothing. Just darkness, then the sensor alert, then more darkness. That's when the understanding began to crystallize, cold and terrible. Whoever had been here knew not just where the cameras were, but also where the sensors were. They knew the timing, the blind spots, the exact positions where they could trigger an alert without appearing on video. They knew because they'd studied, they'd watched, they'd learned. How long had they been watching? I started noticing things, small things. A kitchen chair pulled slightly away from the table, though I couldn't remember moving it. A book on the coffee table face down instead of spine up the way I always left them. The bathroom door ajar when I distinctly recalled closing it that morning. Each instance was minor, explainable, the kind of thing you'd normally attribute to your own faulty memory or the mundane chaos of daily life. But together, they formed a pattern, or did they? I found myself second-guessing everything, obsessively retracing my steps, trying to reconstruct my movements through the house with forensic precision. Had I really closed that door? Was I certain about the chair? The uncertainty itself became a kind of torment, each doubt feeding the next until I couldn't trust my own perception. I installed more cameras, 4 additional ones, covering angles the original system had missed. I set them up myself, drilling into walls at 3 in the morning with the kind of manic energy that comes from sleep deprivation and fear. The house became a web of overlapping surveillance, every corner and corridor captured from multiple angles. If anyone was here, if anyone came back, I'd see them. I'd have proof. But the cameras only showed me walking through rooms, checking locks, peering out windows, me standing motionless in the hallway at odd hours, staring at nothing visible, responding to sounds the microphones didn't pick up. Watching the footage back was disturbing in ways I hadn't anticipated. I looked paranoid, haunted, like someone losing their grip on reality. The nights became the worst. I'd lie in bed, rigid and alert, listening to the house breathe around me. Sometimes I'd hear footsteps, soft, careful footsteps that seemed to pace the hallway outside my room. I'd check the cameras on my phone and there'd be nothing. Empty corridor, undisturbed shadows. But I'd heard them. I was certain I'd heard them. During the day, I started driving past my own house at irregular intervals, taking different routes home from work, varying my schedule in ways that felt both clever and absurd. I was trying to be unpredictable, to break whatever pattern someone might have observed, but the effort itself created a new kind of pattern, the pattern of someone who's afraid, someone who's watching their own back, someone who knows they're being studied. I saw the SUV 3 times, or I thought I did, dark and generic, the kind of vehicle that's everywhere and nowhere. Once parked 2 blocks over, once idling at a gas station I passed on my way to work. Once, and this one made my stomach drop, in my rearview mirror as I turned onto my street. But when I looked again, it was gone. Or it was a different vehicle, or it had never been there at all. The police couldn't help. I called twice more, reporting the SUV, the sounds, the small disturbances in my house. They were polite but increasingly skeptical. The officer who came out the second time, a woman I hadn't met before, suggested gently that stress could cause hypervigilance, that trauma from the break-in might be manifesting in other ways. She gave me the number for a counselor who specialized in victims of property crimes. I didn't call, because I wasn't imagining it. I knew I wasn't. Someone was still watching. Someone was waiting. The realization came slowly, in pieces. The break-in hadn't been about the jewelry boxes. Those were worthless, functionally, costume pieces with sentimental value only to me. But taking them required knowing they were there, knowing their location, knowing I'd be gone long enough for someone to get in and out. The window manipulation from the inside meant access to the house at some prior time to study the security system, to understand how it worked and how to defeat it, which meant they'd been inside before. Maybe multiple times. Maybe while I was home, sleeping, unaware. Maybe they still were. I stopped sleeping in the bedroom. The couch became my permanent station, positioned where I could monitor the cameras, where I could hear any sound from any direction. I lost weight. My coworkers commented on the shadows under my eyes, the way my hands trembled when I held coffee cups, the fact that I jumped whenever someone approached my desk without warning. One night, or maybe it was early morning, time had become elastic and unreliable. I was reviewing camera footage from the previous week, scrubbing through hours of nothing, when I noticed something, a reflection in the hallway mirror, just for a moment, during a period when I'd been at work. The mirror hung at an angle that caught part of the living room, a sliver of window that none of the cameras directly covered. In the reflection, for just 3 frames, maybe 1/10 of a second, a shape, human-sized, human-shaped, standing by that window. But when I advanced frame by frame, it was there, and then it wasn't, and no camera had captured anything in the living room at that timestamp. Just that fleeting ghost in the mirror's reflected world. I must have watched those 3 frames 1,000 times. I enhanced them, brightened them, zoomed in until they pixelated into meaningless blocks of color. The shape remained ambiguous. It could have been a person, could have been a trick of light and shadow, could have been my own desperate need to find evidence of what I knew in my gut was true. The alternative, that I was manufacturing this, that my mind was creating threats where none existed, that the break-in had fractured something fundamental in my ability to perceive reality, was somehow more terrifying than the idea of being watched. Last night, I did something I can't fully explain or justify. I left the house unlocked, all the cameras running, all the sensors armed, but the front door unlocked and the alarm system off. I wanted to see what would happen. I wanted proof, one way or the other. I wanted to force whatever was happening to resolve itself into something concrete, something I could point to and say, "There, see, I'm not crazy." I sat in my car at the end of the block, watching the camera feeds on my phone, waiting. The hours crawled past. Nothing moved. Nothing changed. The house sat there in its pool of porch light, looking utterly normal, utterly mundane. At some point around 4 a.m., I must have dozed off, because I jerked awake to find the sun beginning to rise and my phone battery at 3%. When I went back inside, everything was exactly as I'd left it. Except for one thing. The radio by the door, the one I'd been leaving on at night, was tuned to a different station. Not static, not off. just a different station. Easy listening instead of talk radio. The kind of thing that could be a technical glitch, a frequency drift, a random fluctuation, or the kind of thing someone would do if they wanted you to know they'd been there. If they wanted you to understand that they could come and go as they pleased. If they'd tired of being subtle and decided it was time for you to truly understand how thoroughly they knew you, how completely they'd mapped your life, how easily they could step in and out of your reality whenever they chose. I'm sitting here now, writing this in the cold morning light, and I don't know what's real anymore. I don't know if someone has been systematically invading my space for weeks or months, or if I've been slowly unraveling since that first night, creating an elaborate fiction to explain the anxiety that the break-in left behind. I don't know if the shape in the mirror was a person or a shadow, if the footsteps were real or psychosomatic, if the radio was changed by human hands or by coincidence. What I do know is this: I'm exhausted, I'm scared, and tonight I'll do it all again. The lights, the cameras, the vigilance, the waiting. Because whether the threat is out there or in here, in my house or in my head, I can't stop now. I've studied my own life so thoroughly, created such an intricate system of monitoring and response, that stopping would mean admitting defeat to whoever or whatever has been watching. And they are watching. I know they are. I have to believe they are, because if they're not, if there's no one there and never has been, then what I'm really watching, what I've been documenting so meticulously with all these cameras and sensors and sleepless nights, is the systematic documentation of my own dissolution. The worst part isn't not knowing which is true. The worst part is that I'm not sure it matters anymore. Story 13. The gravel crunches differently now. 3 weeks ago, it was just noise. The rhythmic scatter of stones beneath my feet, the metronome of my evening runs. Now every crunch sounds like a warning, like the earth itself is trying to tell me something I'm too stubborn to hear. I should have stopped running Route 47 after the first time. The black sedan appeared in my peripheral vision around mile 2, engine purring low and deliberate. It stayed behind me for maybe 30 seconds, long enough for my spine to straighten, for my breathing to catch, before it rocketed past, so close the displaced air pushed against my back like an invisible hand. The driver swerved at the last possible moment, tires shrieking against asphalt, leaving me standing in a cloud of exhaust that tasted like burnt rubber and something metallic I couldn't name. I told myself it was just a careless driver, someone texting, maybe, or reaching for something on the passenger seat, the kind of near miss that happens to runners everywhere, the risk we accept when we choose roads over treadmills. I even laughed about it later that evening, standing in my kitchen with a beer sweating in my hand, watching the sunset paint the sky the color of a healing bruise. But the sedan came back, and it brought friends. The second incident happened on a Thursday. I remember because Thursdays I run later, after the sun has already started its descent, when the light turns golden and thick like honey. The shoulder of Route 47 is barely wide enough for one person, just a strip of packed dirt and gravel between the asphalt and the drainage ditch. To my right, the ground drops off sharply into tall grass and cattails that whisper secrets when the wind moves through them. To my left, the road stretches straight for almost 2 miles before curving around the old Wilson property. The red pickup truck crept up behind me so quietly I didn't hear it until it was already there. When I glanced back, my heart lurching in my chest, I saw it matching my pace exactly, maybe 15 miles per hour, slow enough that the engine seemed to grumble with frustration. The passenger window was down. I could see the interior clearly. Cracked vinyl seats, a pair of work gloves on the dashboard, something hanging from the rearview mirror that swayed with the truck's movement. But I couldn't see the driver. The angle was wrong, or the light or something. Just darkness where a face should have been, and the longer I stared, the more that darkness seemed to expand, to bleed outward, until it filled the entire cab. I picked up my pace, legs burning, lungs screaming for air that suddenly felt too thin. The truck accelerated slightly, maintaining that exact 15-foot distance. No words were spoken. No threats. No catcalls. Nothing. Just that patient crawl, like a predator shadowing wounded prey, waiting for the right moment. The silence was worse than anything they could have shouted. Silence has weight. It presses down on you, fills your ears with the rush of your own blood until you can't think straight. After half a mile of this, the truck suddenly gunned its engine and roared past, disappearing around the curve ahead. I stood there gasping, hands on my knees, tasting copper in my mouth. When I finally straightened up and looked around, I realized how alone I was. The nearest house was a quarter-mile back. The construction site for the new subdivision was abandoned at this hour. Just skeletal frames of would-be homes jutting up against the darkening sky like broken teeth. That night, I bought the pepper spray. The canister sits heavy in my pocket during every run now, a small comfort that does nothing to ease the knot of dread that's taken up permanent residence in my gut. I started varying my schedule, different times, different days. Sometimes I'd skip the run entirely, telling myself I was being smart, strategic. But the absence gnawed at me. Running was the one thing that kept me sane after the divorce, after losing the apartment downtown, after everything fell apart, and I ended up in this rental house at the edge of the Pine Hollow development. The runs were supposed to be freedom, solitude, meditation in motion. Now they were something else entirely. The black sedan showed up on a Tuesday morning, 6 a.m., mist still clinging to the ground. It came from behind again, but this time it didn't pass. It pulled alongside me, matching my speed, the dark windows reflecting nothing but gray sky. I couldn't see inside, couldn't see anything but my own distorted reflection running in place on that black glass. The car drifted closer, inch by inch, until I had nowhere to go but the ditch. I stumbled down the embankment, my ankle twisting in the soft mud, and by the time I scrambled back up, the sedan was gone. But now there were two of them in rotation. The truck, the sedan, sometimes alone, sometimes, I swear, passing each other on the road like shift workers clocking in and out. I started taking photos with my phone, hands shaking as I tried to capture license plates, but the images always came out wrong. Blurred, overexposed, or showing nothing at all where I knew a vehicle had been. I deleted them eventually, unsure what they proved anyway. The final straw before I found the tracks was a Friday evening. I was making good time, 3 miles in, approaching the clearing where I usually stop to stretch. The black sedan came screaming up from behind, engine roaring, moving so fast I could feel the heat radiating off its hood. I dove to the side, arms windmilling, and felt something strike my shins. Gravel, bits of broken glass, I don't know. The car's brakes shrieked as it skidded past, leaving black marks on the asphalt that curved away into the distance like a question mark. My legs were bleeding, not badly, just superficial cuts from whatever debris the car had kicked up. But the sight of my own blood running down my calves in thin red streams broke something inside me. This wasn't imagination. This wasn't paranoia. The evidence was right there, written in scratches and bruises and the trembling of my hands as I pressed a torn piece of my shirt against the worst of the cuts. I walked the rest of the way home that day, checking over my shoulder every 30 seconds, jumping at every engine sound. The rational part of my brain kept insisting that I should go to the police, file a report, do something official. But what would I tell them? That cars drove too close to me on a public road? That someone followed me slowly for half a mile without breaking any laws? That I had blurry photos of nothing and a growing certainty that I was being hunted? They'd think I was crazy. Some days I thought I was crazy too. The tire tracks appeared the next morning, carved deep into the muddy shoulder where I always stopped to stretch. Fresh tracks, made within the last few hours based on how sharply defined they were, how the water was still pooling in the deepest grooves. Someone had pulled off the road, sat there idling. The marks showed where the tires had spun slightly, seeking purchase in the soft earth, and then pulled back onto the asphalt. They knew where I stopped. They knew my habits, my route, the private rituals I thought were invisible. The realization settled over me like a cold fog, seeping into my bones, making it hard to breathe. I stood there for 10 minutes, maybe longer, staring at those tracks as if looking hard enough would reveal who made them and why. That afternoon, I walked the trail, my emergency exit, the hidden path through the trees that cuts through to Oakmont Street, bypassing the last quarter mile of Route 47 entirely. I'd found it by accident months ago, following a deer trail that opened up into a narrow corridor between the pines. There's a gap in the old fence line, wide enough to slip through if you turn sideways, and then you're in someone's overgrown backyard before emerging onto the sidewalk 2 blocks from my house. It was my secret, my escape hatch, the thing that let me sleep at night knowing I had options, routes they couldn't predict. Except as I walked the trail that afternoon, I saw signs that someone else had been there, broken branches at shoulder height, too high for deer, a cigarette butt ground into the dirt near the fence gap, still showing traces of moisture, recent, maybe from this morning. And when I emerged onto Oakmont Street, I saw the red pickup truck parked 3 houses down, engine off, windows dark, waiting. I didn't run. I walked back through the trail, forcing myself to move at a normal pace, even though every instinct screamed at me to bolt. When I reached the other end, the black sedan was there, parked on the shoulder of Route 47, exactly where the trail emerged. No one got out. No one approached me. But the message was clear. We know. I should have moved. Should have packed up and left that night, consequences be damned. But where would I go? And how could I be sure they wouldn't follow? The paranoia had roots now, growing deep, spreading wide. I started seeing the vehicles everywhere, parked outside the grocery store, idling at red lights downtown, cruising past my house at odd hours. Or maybe they were different cars, and my mind was just connecting dots that weren't there, seeing patterns in randomness because that's what frightened minds do. I stopped sleeping through the night. Every sound jolted me awake. The creak of settling boards, the distant bark of a dog, the whisper of wind through the eaves. I'd lie there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening for the rumble of an engine, the crunch of tires on gravel. The doctor I finally went to see, a walk-in clinic, anonymous, where I paid cash, asked careful questions about stress, about my medical history, about whether I'd been experiencing any other symptoms. Hallucinations, perhaps? Trouble distinguishing reality from dreams? I told him no, that everything was fine except for the insomnia. He prescribed sleeping pills and suggested I talk to someone, handing me a referral card for a therapist whose office was 3 towns over. I never called the number. Tonight, I ran anyway. Maybe it was defiance, or stupidity, or just the desperate need to prove to myself that I wouldn't be driven from the one thing that still felt like mine. The evening was clear, temperature dropping fast, that particular quality of autumn air that tastes like metal and dying leaves. I made it 2 miles before I saw the black sedan appear in the distance behind me. My hand went automatically to the pepper spray, fingers closing around the familiar shape. The sedan approached slowly, and I prepared to dive into the ditch if necessary, muscles tense, heart hammering against my ribs. But it didn't speed up. It just followed, patient and inevitable, maintaining that same 15-foot distance the truck had used weeks before. I could feel the weight of its attention on my back, heavy and cold. When I reached my usual turning point, I didn't hesitate. I plunged into the trail between the trees, branches whipping at my face, roots grabbing at my feet in the gathering darkness. Behind me, I heard the sedan's engine die. No doors opened, no footsteps followed, but I knew they were there, watching, waiting. I made it to the fence gap, squeezed through, and ran across the overgrown yard. My lungs burned, my vision swam, but I didn't stop until I burst onto Oakmont Street. The red pickup was there, parked exactly where it had been before, engine running this time, exhaust pluming white in the cold air. I froze, trapped between going forward and going back. The driver's door opened, slowly. I didn't wait to see who emerged. I sprinted down the sidewalk toward my house, pepper spray clutched in my hand like a talisman. 2 blocks never felt so long. Every shadow seemed to move. Every parked car could have been hiding one of them. I hit my front door at full speed, fumbled with the keys, and finally crashed inside, slamming the bolt home. Through the window, I watched. The street was empty. No truck, no sedan, just pools of lamplight and the gentle sway of tree branches in the wind. I stood there for an hour, maybe longer, watching for any sign of movement. Nothing. I'm writing this now because I need to document what's happening while I can still trust my own memory, because tonight, after everything settled and the adrenaline finally drained away, I found something that changed everything. It was sitting on my kitchen counter, a photograph, slightly out of focus, showing a man running on the shoulder of a road. The angle suggests it was taken from a moving vehicle. The man in the photo is me. I recognize my running shoes, my jacket, the distinctive way my left arm swings a bit wider than my right. But here's what makes my blood run cold. The photo is dated 3 months from now. December 19th, according to the small numbers in the bottom corner. I live alone. My doors were locked. No one has a key. The photo shouldn't exist, can't exist, and yet I'm holding it in my hands right now, the glossy paper cool against my fingers. I've checked it over and over, looking for signs of manipulation, for any logical explanation. There isn't one, unless this is all in my head. Unless I took the photo myself during some fugue state I can't remember. Unless the sedan and the truck and the following and the fear are all constructs of a mind that's been slowly unraveling since long before I ever set foot on Route 47. Unless I'm the one who's been leaving the tire tracks, documenting my own movements, creating an elaborate persecution fantasy because the real horror, the crushing weight of loneliness and failure and a life that fell apart, was too mundane to bear. But then I look at the date again, December 19th, 3 months from now. And I realize that whether this is real or madness doesn't matter anymore. Either way, I'll still be running. Either way, they'll still be following. And on December 19th, one way or another, I'll find out which of us is real.